Meta-War, Layers of Meaning and Intent, a series of essays on the complexities and actualities of language use in varied communication types. Max will also explore and explain how perception and worldview impacts understanding and our use of technologies. These essays and the addendums lay out what at first might seem to be divergent concepts, however they are connected. It will require you to contemplate each section and the totality of the whole offered here to you. If you are patient, you will learn a great deal. Author, Othniel Max Daves.
Meta-War, Layers of Meaning and Intent. Remember to test what I post on social media and communicate in other content forms. You are in a highly complex information environment. Also remember that language sets used can convey many layers of meaning. I refer you to some of my posts on Hidden in Plain Sight, Means and Methods in Semiotics. The world loves dramatic stories. That is carried over to social media. The blurring of the lines between story and weaponized narratives is as much a symptom of a lack of perceived intended context on social media as the lack of digital media literacy and discernment in users. The war against freedom of speech is predicated on a basis of approved speech regardless of intent or thematic usage. The growing malady of triggered confirmation biases combined with ignorance and irrationality in the perceivers is being codified into algorithms which reflect those biases. This is the end goal of those who wish to control and censor speech. By using algorithms, they think they can claim plausible deniability without serious penalties while accomplishing their goals and objectives in waging an ideological, economic, and political shadow war in cyberspace. They do this in order to gain control of the 7 spheres of influence with their approved narratives while mitigating competing or oppositional points of view. Communication of ideas and concepts involves a complex interplay between the transmission method type and the perceiver. This is how secure and complex layers of meaning and intended messaging can be tailored to a multiplicity of perceiver types simultaneously with each layer or combination of layers. As you can see, language usage can be much more dynamic in depth of encoded information as well as incredibly adaptive, working on many levels of perception and understanding at one time. Here wherein is the problem with nearly all approaches implemented for use in analysis algorithms. Parsing out content author intent is nearly impossible when taking into account the potential for layers of conveyed information. When high-level use of semiotic techniques are involved, the process can become even more difficult for both artificial and manual human analysts to discern the intent, the actual messages, and to whom the coded information is intended to reach in terms of actual perceiver types. Thus, the current approaches to analysis are not only prone to high error rates but also have a definitive flaw resident in their rudimentary approaches to begin with due to built-in process and procedural biases at various resolutions that corrupt the entire analysis process. Knowing these limitations and vulnerabilities that are present in all human-based and artificial intelligence-based systematic analysis, both can be easily gamed and manipulated or tricked into faulty assumptions based upon a flawed starting point alone. The more complex the information and the layers of perceivable contextual meaning, the worse both human and AI systems perform. There have been attempts to use fractal pattern analysis techniques to parse out deeper resolutions of potential intent and encoded layers of messaging. However, that method also suffers from similar issues as the aforementioned ones due to inherent complexities and dynamic adaptive contextual framing by the author, and the cognitive and conceptual capabilities of intended perceiver or perceivers. Language is much more adaptive and dynamic than most would ever suspect. It is living in a sense and configures in such a way that both points of transmission, original source output to inputs of perceivers, are not static, though the text usage or auditory and or visual combined usages may appear to be to unintended observers and analysts. Here is where HIP's method of communications, even in its most rudimentary form, far exceeds even the most robust systems of analysis. I tell you all of this to say that quantity of data apprehended only leads to complexity and higher attrition and subsequent error rates in analyst accuracies. Here wherein is found the folly of current intelligence gathering approaches. Artificial intelligence is only as good as those who build it to extend their human capabilities. If their worldview is flawed, and it is, they impart that vulnerability to the artificial intelligence which they use for analysis. This is why relying upon it is unwise. The tool is not greater than the creator of the tools, though it may be able to extend the perception of it. Going deeper into language and the necessity of worldview. When evaluating information of any kind, including symbologic language, original intent and its contextual accuracy is necessary. Patterns are everywhere. This is so because the temporal world is patterned. It has levels of order. The meaning of those patterns are not always readily apparent. However, that does not mean that it is not what it appears. Here the complexities of use of symbologies intersect with the complexities of human perception, psychology, and gain knowledge. Confirmation bias can play a big role in the perceived by the perceiver. Projection of preconceived notions of meaning, be them corrupted, mixed or accurate, illuminate these things in either the light of truth, being the divine logos, or the false light of deception being misappropriated, misapplied, and misused gain temporal knowledge. There is a reason we often say that one should not lean on their own understanding. Apart from the light of God, we all have a vulnerability towards corruption, including how such vulnerabilities impact how we perceive ourselves, one another, and the world around us. This is why an authentic desire to seek the truth in all things requires humility at all times. For the seeking of truth is a process which requires both the liberation of oneself from the darkness of lies, fear, and confusion, even as it reveals itself in that which is beyond oneself. It is an inward to outward transformational process. This is at once a linear progression in temporal time and a nonlinear process of restoration of what was previously hidden from view before the process began, which impacts the future. Reliance upon one's faith in God does not mean it is blind faith. Quite the contrary. It's a growing trust in the process of things being revealed in the intended contextual framework, which illuminates and unifies deep understanding with divine wisdom and saving knowledge in and by the divine logos. This is why humility is first necessary. It is also why pride blinds those ruled by it to the reality they are in darkness of mind and heart. One cannot be liberated from that darkness being positionally in the very darkness that blinds them to their predicament in pride. Thus, the prideful and fearful base their judgment upon all things upon external appearances and perceptions born of their five senses and their minds apart from the spirit of truth, which is the light. This is why we say that the spirit of the age has blinded the minds of people and that they are in darkness. Thus they are ruled by lies and easily manipulated by such based upon how things appear. They're bereft of discernment. They call good evil and evil good, being unaware of the inversion which they see themselves in the world around them. From this comes a virulent form of corruption called self-righteousness. What follows is virtue signaling and demands by them for others to be complicit and compliant even by means of force, being proxies for a lie. As for people, so too for nations. Broken cisterns, corrupted data. My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. Jeremiah 2:13. You cannot capture truths in a bottle and think you have truth. You cannot deny objective truth and design neural networks that can do it for you. For your creations are a mirror of yourselves. Something of the Creator is always present in their creations. Now apply this to algorithms designed to discern truth from fiction. Truth is dynamic and ever-flowing, not static, and apprehended by recording it alone. Complexity is seen in layers of encrypted knowable contextual intent. Those layers cannot be accessed just through external observation alone. Perception is a curious thing. A key opens encrypted data. Meta-keys are one-use methods in access control. Understanding is highly dynamic and often more nonlinear and fractal than linear. To access certain perception layers of access, certain contextual foundations must be in place before the next layers can be decrypted and integrated into the perceiver's unified experiential knowledge framework. Memory in contextual reality is highly complex. I'll be getting in this more later from a multidisciplinary perspective, including the biblical worldview framework of beasts and giants, a brief commentary on the use of layers of meaning and language within various biblical and extra-biblical texts. The spread of evil on the earth in the primordial age has been a focal point in scholarship on the Book of Watchers. In this article I have attempted to explore how ancient Enochic texts recount the crimes of the offspring of the Watchers on earth, and their recompense. The evil that increases on the earth takes the form of the giants murdering and consuming creatures of the earth, not unlike their angelic fathers, who cannot restrain their sexual desire for the women of earth. The giants cannot control their appetites for the food of the earth. Their insatiability drives their actions and has disastrous consequences for the earth and themselves. The role of their appetite and their crimes is reflected in the form of the punishment they receive. They are forced to remain on earth as spirits that cannot eat. This should be interpreted, I have suggested, as meaning that they are punished by being hungry and yet be unable to sate that hunger. The themes of consumption, as well as murder, anthropophagy, and the drinking of blood are prominent in the Book of Watchers and in other Enochic texts such as Jubilees, the Animal Apocalypse, and the Book of Giants. All of these texts reformulate the Watchers myth. Despite their differences, They all prominently appropriate the themes of appetite and consumption. The monstrous appetites of the giants are critical for understanding the consequences of the Watcher's descent and sexual activities on Earth. Matthew Goff, author of the white paper, Monstrous Appetites, Giants, Cannibalism, and Insatiable Eating in Enochic Literature. I always find these topics extremely interesting and the scholarly work on them fascinating. Even so, I often find many gaps in the research which miss some basic foundation stones which might make their works more complete and possibly prove their thoughts on various subjects and topics. The ancient texts which mention beasts and giants are rich in narratives and language usage which we think in our time as mythic or merely fables without any real-world contextual validity. I would beg to differ on the basis of language usage, cultural dialectics, and historical realities. Permit me to give you an example by walking you through a little exercise using this topic of giants and beasts. Let us look at the interplay of descriptors and language sets in biblical and other ancient texts. There are some definitive themes which emerge in cross-cultural descriptions which do seem to point to something occurring in the time of those writings, prior to it and even in our present times. Here are a few contextual examples. The phrase, "the lion is the king of beasts," can be read a few ways metaphorically even while keeping the lion an actual animal we know as a literal lion. Let me illustrate. Do actual lions in the wild or in captivity have an actual king over them? And by the use of beast, does that mean all animals or just a particular type of animal? What if the word beast has a particular historical and cultural usage intent here? Likewise, we can look at the phrase likewise. The lion is the king of the beasts. This does not presuppose that the metaphorical lion couldn't be a metaphorical king of both metaphorical and literal beasts. In the same manner, it might also be interpreted that a literal lion might be the literal king of quite literal beasts, as might be used in fairy tales. Even if the usage in such a context is literal, the intent of the overall story may well be metaphorical as employed in allegories. Again, how something is used contextually on many levels and why it is used is important to consider. Likewise, it is important to look at the translations of a given word and or phrase individually, together and in the broader contextual, cultural, and historical frameworks. What if the word used was empires rather than beasts? How would that change the way you read and comprehended the phrase? So you see how difficult it can be to discern the proper meaning of various written and spoken words, much less the intent of the writer, if there is not other information available to develop a more comprehensive perspective. This is why people can read the exact same thing and come away from it comprehending it completely differently from one another. Here wherein we find the crux of the problem, don't we? When translating and interpreting those translations of content, the intended meaning can be lost, confused, or completely changed to something the author never intended. So too it is for spoken content, though it does have more data like intonation, speed, and other cues to offer to the listener, who must then interpret it. Here we have the transmitter and those who receive it, who then must make sense of it before they retransmit it to others. Here is the classic telephone call game paradox, where a message is transmitted over and over down the line to each player. Now let us look into the giant language used in the white paper excerpt. 1. The beasts and giants both devour human flesh. 2. Both destroy and kill human beings and animals alike. 3. The beasts and the giants are both adversarial to God and his people. 4. They mislead humanity and the earth itself, filling it with blood and violence. 5. They destroy God's creation. They have an insatiable hunger, related to addiction. 6. They rise to kill, steal, and destroy. 7. They teach women and men forbidden knowledge by which they corrupt both and use them to corrupt others. They enslave both and cause them to enslave others. 8. They destroy those whom they enslave. At this point, having established some cross-cultural and textual shared deceptions, let's go deeper. Dynamically encoded language and semiotics in usage and perception. Now consider these previous descriptions in terms of both literal and figurative language. Consider also that which utilizes these descriptors throughout all of history in our present day in the micros and the macros, not the other way around. Then once you have done so, you can then do it in reverse form, present day to the ancient past. How do we use literal and figurative language today? How would those cultures use it? And how do you discern whether something is being described in literal, figurative, or some hybridization of both in the proper contextual application then and now? Do we not use similar language regarding these? Yes, we do, but maybe not from the point of view the ancients used it, though there are similarities and even some precise sameness of usage. Let us move to the next part of the exercise in analyzing the text. Answer these questions. To what do we generally ascribe these following traits? What destroys the earth? and people? What devours the earth and people? What causes violence and bloodshed? What enslaves people in our time? What tempts and then causes addictions? Is not gluttony a form of addiction? Is not lust in all of its forms of insatiable addiction? Is not all forms of addiction a type of enslavement? How do addictions rule the addicted? Is it not by fear and uncontrollable insatiable hungers for more of the addicting people, places, and things? Do you not see an increase in injustice, violence, and bloodshed wherever addictions reign? And what does this cause? Is it not fear and terror? And what is fear? False evidence appearing real. Is that not deception? Is not deception meant to entice, entrap, and enslave? For what purpose is this done? Is it not to control, to use, to abuse, to plunder, to devour, and to destroy? What then do you think the beasts and giants represent? Are not beasts collective peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations ruled by various forms of governmental and organizational structures? This is conveyed non-linearly throughout the Bible, meaning that the keys to understanding are hidden in plain sight throughout the biblical texts, and in both original language usage and translated versions of those original texts. Let's go back to the exercise. Answer these questions. What then are corporations, and governments, and empires, and kingdoms, and principalities? What combines all of these in an aggregated amalgam? Do we not use the terms giant and beast to describe corporations, organizations, governments, nations, militaries, and ideologies which capture and use them for evil? Do we not use this terminology for individuals as well as large collections of individuals acting together? Is this not a micro and macro application? The language used to describe various beasts are not unlike that used by native Aboriginal usage of animal totems in various amalgams. The concept of the imperial dragon in Chinese culture constructs the body of the dragon with an amalgam of 9 creatures as descriptors combined for the totality of the whole beast. Now what are the heads of the metaphorical dragon with 7 heads in the book of Revelation? Do we not call the leaders of nation-states as heads of state? If these leaders are heads, what then constitutes the body? Do we not use such language as the term the body politic? What do the heads represent beyond leaders? Thoughts, ideologies, worldviews, perceptions, and actions. Is this not the assigning a linguistic singular usage to a plurality of citizens? Likewise, so we not also to the same language sets in corporations and or other organizational constructs like institutions such as that of the educational nature that we call universities. Here we have integrated symbolic and literal as well as singular and plural unifying usage in just 2 words, the head and the body. So here we have both an individual leader or group of leaders spoken of as heads of their bodies being organizations, corporations, institutions, and nation-states. What is necessary for all of these to exist? People. For without people there be neither heads nor bodies literally and figuratively. Here we see the integration of multiple types of language usage being integrated into a singular meshing of the micros and macros and singularities and the pluralities. The paradox of decoding language with human reasoning alone. There is that which is in the observable, measurable, temporal world and that which lies beyond it in what I call the metasphere. It is the metasphere in which the 7 spheres of society and societal influence does so exist. All of that which comprises the micros makes up the macros. Said another way, the individual parts collectively make the whole thing. They each distinct yet distinctly integrated and interconnected in both their existence as well as their impacts, whether they be seen or not. Every single impact collectively together creates an aggregated global reality. This reality is not the totality of reality. It may be complex, however, it is still potentially observable and measurable even if the sheer magnitude of it overwhelms the individual and even the collective of all individuals of humanity together to fathom. Even though it can be measured to some degree, even our created means of doing so are insufficient to do so. Now if this be what can be potentially observed and measured yet is not what makes you think that you can so quickly discount that which may exist that you cannot measure beyond its shadow and effects thereof on the observable. After all, if you cannot observe it and measure it, is rather arrogant to say that nothing cannot exist beyond what you can and call it science or enlightenment. For you assume wrongly that you know and comprehend what has come before exhaustively when those in the past which came before you laid the foundations for what you do know of which you know so very little. Like you, many of them also presumed wrongly that nothing could exist beyond what they could readily observe, measure, and conceive of in their imaginations. Yet also like you they were clearly wrong. For you now know many things they never thought possible, even if you do not know all they knew before you. Yet you still think that your knowledge and comprehension of what you think exists and is possible is not limited, and your presuppositions are not also prone to self-deception and arrogance. I am sure that what you do not know exists you cannot ponder. Yet why is it that when others might do so you quickly discard it as myth or a figment of my own imagination? Let us be blunt here. Likewise, it is arrogant to assume that what you do not know or are even willing to investigate does not exist. Suppose in some manner I could apprehend your own imagination and use it. I would bet that your refusal to contemplate it would not be so rigid. The existence or non-existence of something is not dependent upon you. It is dependent upon whether or not it actually exists. The fact that you may not perceive it does not change the existence of it, yet it does to you. Here is where humility is vast in necessity. For that which you do not know you certainly will not know if you refuse to acknowledge that it might and be willing to investigate it earnestly. If you cannot comprehend all that is right in front of you using your five senses, cognitive abilities and created tools, applying your technologies capable of measurement, what makes you think you can comprehend what all of them out together cannot see? For all you use is based upon the very temporal materialism and finite reasoning which is limited to the temporal. Some might say that those confines can be superseded by use of pharmacological, physical deprivation and psychological means, and they would be correct in part. They still can only see to the wall of the metasphere, not beyond it. So what it is they observe using such means? And how do they know that what they are seeing and interacting with is not dangerous? For the metaphysical is still not the realm metaspherical, though it is the realm of those who are banned from it. Consider now what was written before. Reread the document from the beginning to this point again before moving onward. Commentary: the relationship of the metasphere, the psychosphere and fractal level insight, a meta-gray war. All thoughts and behaviors are encoded and are observable in fractal patterns. These patterns are not discernible by most people, but they are indeed there. Science has proven fractal level insight in a number of ways. The paradox here wherein is in the discernment, accurate data contexting, and translation of patterns into meaningful actionable intelligence. The human mind is given to assumption born out of how our brains fill in the gaps from unconscious up through the subconscious to the conscious mental states. These assumptions can lead people to faulty foundations of data interpretation. No one can be 100% accurate. The complexity of the human condition is both a strength and the weakness of our mortal existence. When working at the fractal insight level, one must balance a deductive approach with the humility of knowing one's propensity towards data gap assumptions. Gamification techniques are helpful in eliminating faulty assumption deductively. Metasphere influencing, that's the psychospherical seeding. That psychospherical seeding in turn triggers the micros and aggregations to the macros. Being the metasphere, the systems of human observational tools, no matter how technologically advanced they may appear, still remain at nanoterm post-event status. In other words, at best they are extrapolating from near-past occurrences to predict probabilities of future trends. This is still chasing the winds of the metasphere. To actually step forward in time-space beyond the observable applied past and present into the future cannot be achieved algorithmically in and of itself. This is where science becomes meta-science. Meta is a prefix used in English to indicate a concept which is an abstraction from another concept, used to complete or add to the latter. I am here using the word meta as in seeing the complete picture by adding to the incomplete picture the actual missing pieces which unifies the whole in its intended context. Meta denoting a change of position or condition beyond what is traditionally thought of as possible by most people. Meta also denoting something of a higher or second-order kind which transcends the generally accepted norms. Higher than what, you may ask? Well, let's look at the phrase higher-order thinking. That phrase is the answer, meaning ordered thinking and perceptions that have been liberated from the entropy and limitations of lower normative observation tools. Knowledge, methods, and an insufficient consciousness which are all locked in a present to past and past to present to future perception. This incomplete picture leads to faulty assumptions based upon insufficient or rather incomplete and incorrect suppositions. Yet it is the function of such thinking to reactively and, dare I say prematurely, project its own lack of data and proof testing upon those whose assertions may very well be correct regardless of where the present gradients into the future and the probability predictive approach moves smoothly into the future now paradigm is the realm of the meta. The meta reveals the unity that was, is, and will be in singularity of heart, mind, and perception. All of past, present, and future history finds its context there. In the metasphere, though unseen by use of the human senses and cognitive functions of in and of themselves, the meta-realm provides the unified point of view encompassing and correctly contextualizing past, Present and future is one singular picture. It is this unified aggregated data snapshot which allows for high-level discernment of fractal-level insight to yield actionable intelligence proactively. No formulas nor algorithms can be devised which can break out of its temporal lock into the meta aside from assumption-based event probabilities. However, the ability to view the finite linear from a meta POV is not possible for human beings without those constituent parts of observable, testable, experiential knowledge and perception gleaned from the temporal psychosphere. I call the place where the testable, observable data leaps into the metasphere the meta-observer or metaspherical perceiver. They operate in that space where the intuitive and the analytical unify in harmony. Their brains are unisphered, meaning that both hemispheres of their brains function as one integrated system. But this alone is not the determinant. They have what some call that otherness, a meta-connection that religionists call spirituality. It is quite literally a renewing, reordering, and unifying of their cognitive and emotive consciousness that links and orients their worldview and associated perceptions to something beyond the finite confines temporal reality. That is where the metasphere transcends the psychospherical gray matter. These meta-perceivers are affected by the same things that the temporal locked perceivers do, yet they are not enslaved nor beholden to it. They can, in a very real sense, see through it for what it is. The incomplete and contextually disordered temporal reality being made complete in the great processes of time and space. They live in the already and not yet, a place many call the eternal now or ever present. Here we are calling that the metasphere. Entering into the metasphere is not simply a break from one thing to another, but rather a transformative gradient whose action contextualizes the aggregated data patterns from past, present, and future to a point of convergence called singularity. It is at singularity that incomplete data sets become complete in the meta-perceiver's POV, an experiential reality, much like a camera lens being focused from a blur to sharpness of detail. The longer they live in the metasphere, the clearer their fractal-level insight becomes. Their higher-ordered discernment of pattern increases and their accuracy flow exponentially grows, provided they remain attuned to their own propensity for error and remain demure. So how does one know the difference between the true metacognitive perceiver and the temporal locked perceiver? A divergent psychospherical perceiver can only observe and test the metaspherical perceiver's assertions by traditional or normative methodologies after the predictive event has occurred. The meta-perceived is proven over time, which is problematic for the former to appreciate or accept due to their temporal precognitive POV encrypted logic. The neuroimprinting of the temporal perceived acts as a morphological encryptor, blocking them from moving beyond temporal experience and observable in that state of mind, like those whose perceptions are limited to the temporal observable and available data alone. Metacognitive thinkers have experiential neuroimprinting also. However, metacognitives' unified meta-intuitive and meta-analytical perceptions have a self-correction balancing effect on their experiences and how those experiences are contextualized, presenting them with a more accurate POV of themselves and the reality in which they operate in. This I call ethereal discernment. Intuition. 1. Direct perception of truth, fact, etc. Independent of any reasoning process, immediate apprehension. 2. A fact, truth, etc. Perceived in this way. 3. A keen and quick insight. 4. The quality or ability of having such direct perception or quick insight. 5. Philosophy. An immediate cognition of an object not inferred or determined by a previous cognition of the same object. Any object or truth so discerned. Pure, untaught, non-inferential knowledge. 6. Linguistics. The ability of the native speaker to make linguistic judgments, as of the grammaticality, ambiguity, equivalence, or non-equivalence of sentences, deriving from the speaker's native language competence. Origin, 1400, 50, Late Middle English, lesser than Late Latin, intuition, contemplation. Equivalent to Latin intuit, past participle of inturi, to gaze it, contemplate plus ion. C in 2, tuition. Related forms in 2, tion, less, adjective. Analytic, 1 of or relating to analysis or analytics, especially separating something into component parts or constituent elements. 2. Being a proposition whose truth is evident from the meaning of the words it contains. Compare synthetic. 3. Skilled in or using analysis, especially in thinking or reasoning. 4. Characterized by analysis rather than inflection. 5. Psychoanalytic. 6. Treated or treatable by or using the methods of algebra and calculus. The metasphere, a war in the overarching meta-narrative. The metasphere is embroiled in a war between competing worldviews. This battle is in its essence, first a spiritual one. Advanced state cognitive pathologies from fear, denial, and systematic pride. How weaponized information and weaponized social media distorts, divides, deceives, dilutes, devours, and destroys. Language is an interesting thing as it pertains to the manner which people perceive its use and pour into it their subjective contextual frameworks. In social media, language usage when combined with images as in video and memes are nearly always linked to preconceived perception bias in creating a confirmation bias distortion loop in which triggers the perceiver, who then projects their triggered emotive response upon the source of the social media post, thereby exposing themselves and their bias. This most often results in personal attacks or some snarky attempt to cast aspersions upon the same source as an attempt by the perceiver to transfer and displace their own insufficiencies upon them. The personal attack is a merely sign of the perceiver's insecurities and biases, which bypasses their rational brain, preventing rational and respectful discourse. In short, it reveals their pride and blind spots, even as their unfounded accusations reveal their intent by stripping them of their self-perceived covertness. Prolonged social media use reinforces these trigger mechanisms in the brain, much like an abusive relationship reinforces fight or flight defense mechanisms. Now, the complexities of all human beings, as well as each individual's collective experiences, both real and imagined, combine with their knowledge base and these reinforcing external influencers to feed the confirmation bias feedback loops in increasing dissonance and distortions of the person's perceptions. That echoes back in a return phase in triggered responses modalities. Once this occurs and the individual projects their triggered response upon another, their brain expects a response which will conform to their preconceived expectation of the targeted individual's response, in line with their self-referential confirmation biases which created the conflict to begin with in their original projections. This is what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy cycle. In advanced state pathologies, such people will invent the expected triggered response from their target without regard to that targeted individual's actual response. This we call yet another confirmation bias reinforcement cycle, which imprints more false memories and distortions of perceived events. The effects of weaponized information and propaganda within the framework of micro-targeting of individuals within sub-demographic categories fuels the aforementioned pathological cycling in the individual, increasing the accelerated entropic effects upon the cognitive functioning of said individual while blinding them to the increasing seriousness of their predicament, much in the same way a serious addiction moves exponentially towards that mortal terminus of zero tolerance, causing an overdose. The entire pathological process as such moves from neurosis to psychosis into a termination phase for the individual's original personality, conforming them into a beast-like creature controlled completely by their cognitive illness, which has in a very real sense reprogrammed their perceptions and subsequent and nearly absolute involuntary behaviors broken off from reality and any form of normative self-discipline and rational restraint. They are quite literally brainwashed, becoming a proxy for the cognitive distorting illnesses which have conformed them into nearly constant delusion, terminating their personality. Individuals who are approaching terminal state cognitive pathology live in a synthetic world in which their cognitive break has locked them into with complex denial mechanisms coupled with hyper-simplified extreme emotive and behavioral interactions with others in the actual real world at large. In short, such individuals are so owned by their delusions that they become quite literally in their one mind's absolute sovereigns in all their ways and all of their interactions with others, completely devoid of any rational thought to their predicament. They march to their destruction in nearly constant dopamine surges, blissfully believing the rightness of their wrongness in perceptions and actions. There are many examples of this level of self-deception and self-destructive delusion throughout history, from Caligula to the Nazi leadership at Nuremberg. In each case, they projected their own delusions upon everyone else, right up their own demise in a sickening state of euphoria at their own destruction. Such are these times and what all are living in. I have no doubt some will try to apply this wrongly to one side or the other absolutely, while never seeing they are actually exposing gaps in their own perceptions and thinking while exempling this I have written to you. Exposing themselves. The circustry of the deceptive postmodern post-truth mindset. What was at work in the circustry of the Kavanaugh hearings by the DNC? Hypersubjectivism, which denies the notion of objective truth, favoring subjective dynamic and often morphological notions of truth being in the eye of the perceiver rather than a basis in objective truth. Verified evidence and actual facts. Being that the postmodern mind is firmly entrenched in the notion that all things are relative and subject to the perceptions and defining by the subjective perceiver. They deny objective truth out of hand as unknowable and see facts and evidence as subject to their a priori preconceived assumptions without regards to logical coherence of the facts and evidence, or lack thereof, thereby allowing to project their personal opinions, biases, and wishes upon others using a mechanism called language gameplay. Postmodernist philosopher Jean-Francois Lyotard's use of the term language gameplay is primarily applied in the context of authority, power, and legitimation. Jean-Francois Lyotard explicitly drew upon Wittgenstein's concept of language games in developing his own notion of meta-narratives in the postmodern condition. However, Wittgenstein's concept is, from its inception, of a plurality of language games. Their plurality is not taken to be a feature solely of contemporary discourse, because Lyotard's discussion is primarily applied in the context of authority, power, and legitimation, where Wittgenstein's is broad and concerned to mark distinctions between a wide range of activities in which language users engage. We can deduce that Lyotard uses the language gaminess which Wittgenstein points out to direct his own analysis and attention to the ways in which certain language games, when in service to ideals, tend to form ideas about the world and their navigation, and that the larger language gameplay whereby these certain smaller language games are more likely to play out in certain conglomerations that reinforce and comment upon the opinion side of relationships between propositions about the world, at the risk of denying important contrary or non-similar judgments if they clash with typical gameplay. In this way, Lyotard implies that algorithms of viable strategies of gameplay, while certainly extant, are seldom used consistently, eventually leading to societal disruption and the realignment of basic language games with common actions and thoughts. Appearances of something is not always the reality of something in the light of facts. The emotive alone is not a sole indicator of facts and validity. We have an evidential fact-based system of justice. One can believe something is real even when it is not. The complexity of the human mind and perceptions with what we know now is still insufficient to provide full understanding of how the human brain, interfacing dynamic psychological processes and perception, integrate. The emotive triggers confirmation validation processes in the brain. These processes are highly vulnerable to induced mutable effects. Past experiences are linked to the emotive triggered response dynamic. Prolonged stress and traumatic events can create distortion in these linkages. This is not simply a one-time event, but rather combines with other past to present experiential inputs, creating amplified cumulative effects in the neuroimprint, fueling cognitive feedback loops. Traumatic events can impair accuracy and memory while creating the appearance of accuracy in the individual, which to them is absolutely believable. The projective nature of such can lead to unintended wrong perceptions, leading to faulty reasoning, displacement, and transference mechanisms. For example, the rule of civil law is not an exercise in subjective enforcement to serve delusions of the misguided power-hungry elitist, faux intellectual patricians, not global utopianists whose vision of a one world, one state, one ruling social caste of one percenters fueling their war for such with bankrupt philosophy, and an inherently irrational and ethically corrupting coherent worldview. Selective enforcement of the law degrades the entirety of the Codex of Civil Law. Likewise, to accuse and condemn in the false court of public opinion is epitome of subversion of due process and jurisprudence. Arbitrary enforcement of civil law erodes the entire foundation of governance and will only lead to more confusion and chaos in the populace. This, of course, will only lead to more division and conflict as the people lose their respect for both the cohesive civil codex and the authority of the civil gov itself. What in effect occurs when the malady of the postmodernist and hypersubjectivist gains positions of power and authority? Like their morphological thoughtscape, they attempt to arbitrarily force their will upon all without regard to the consequences to themselves nor the broader society, having no respect for objective truth nor the rule of law. Thusly it is lawlessness, not justice. As it is for people, so too do is for nations. Othniel Max Daves. Addendum 1I, a dialogue with a colleague questioning my use of language. Dennis, now this restated below from you is a clever retort. First off, poetry is a form of prose. However, prose is not exclusively poetry. Humor me and unpack how you arrived at such the assertion below. You said, sounds like you want to write prose yet have them interpreted as poems. An ad hominem argument, huh? Interesting. Well played. Let me attempt to give you a bit of pushback to sharpen you also. I appreciate a shrewd thinker. Didn't Jesus tell us, be as wise as serpents and as gentle as doves? Permit me the honor of giving your response the due diligence it deserves, being that you alone were willing to have a lively chat among the commenters on the posts. Let us start from the very beginning, shall we? Based upon your initial comment stating me a troll. Such a proclamation is in actuality troll-like behavior, being that is usually intended as an insult. Why did you not simply address the post and engage me directly in dialogue instead of clearly being in error? It is curious that you accused me of being a troll on my own post and now make the leap of assumption to presume that your statement above is accurate. Some might consider that bad form itself, perhaps even projective in nature. That said, I do not presume to assume to know your own intent nor the mechanisms which might be underlining such statements. I merely state the obvious and cogent-minded pattern in your own usage of language. If your profile is indeed accurate, and I have no reason to discount nor fully accept it, one would think that you would be much more thoughtful than such trite comments. I have no doubt you are much more astute than you let on. I gave you the benefit of the doubt, did I not? Did I not offer you the opportunity to explain your comment before rushing to judgment? Now, if the situation was reversed, would you have extended me the same grace? Upon whose authority and upon what standards does one base their judgment upon intent of messages? Would you prefer me to silo my language usage to the lowest common denominator in all use cases? To my knowledge, we are not connected. How would you know how I communicate with my intended audience beyond the singular post? Did you not presume to know their ability or lack thereof in comprehension of my posts? Do you find fault with the Bible? After all, it does not conform to the standardization as one would demand at the Pentagon or the halls of the Academy. The Bible is, after all, a book of books filled with all manner of language usage that defies the standards of our intellectually endemic times. It is, as you might say, written in prose and poetry alongside the usage of many other types of literature and linguistic approaches. Do we castigate those who do not comprehend every jot and tittle of it? Or it's in verse? Let it not be. Perhaps some would like me to base my use of language on obscure polymorphic community standards, which are at best a guess as to intent of various constructs of language and word usage. Are we to conform to that which is clearly lacking proper basis for making such demands? Personally, I do not bend a knee to shape-shifting legal maneuvers nor its twin, confirmation bias projective tactics. You stated, my position is the sender is responsible for the message being received. If constantly misunderstood, the fault is with the sender. Send so only a single interpretation is possible. If the trumpet is uncertain, who will respond? Are you asking if I believe a genocide is ongoing, or should limit my comments to the comment alone in this thread? First off, I do not spoon-feed my network. I have a great deal of respect for their intellectual capacities and their willingness to engage directly with me. Communication in my network is two-way, not simply me projecting into the digital ether. Some of foremost thinkers and leaders in this nation across multiple disciplines are present in my network. This is not by happenstance, nor is my approach using social media as I do happenstance either. Yes, it is unconventional by most standards, however, it is effective and does achieve results, as I said earlier. After all, you respond back to me privately, did you not? We are discussing this matters respectfully and in a manner which will hopefully sharpen us both. Don't you agree? Sender versus perceiver. Context is everything in communication. Each discipline and professional sphere, such as that of the DOD, all have various standards which do not readily transfer to the others. In fact, there is much confusion and complexity between the language sets utilized in the various fields of expertise. Likewise, within each of those there is a vast spectrum of understanding and comprehension levels held by those who inhabit those IORs found there wherein. Do you not agree with this? The sender is not always responsible for the comprehension of those who have no desire to comprehend it or even a capability to do so. I would say in some cases that may be the case, in others that would not be the case. In many cases, the message communicated may in fact not even be for those who by happenstance may apprehend such communications. If they are not in the intended audience, would the sender still be responsible for it? Of course not. Likewise, if someone does not understand the immediate message being communicated to them intentionally, there are many reasons by which their lack of understanding might impact the process that has little or even nothing to do with the sender of said message. To presume to know all of those many variables without the data and due diligence in obtaining and analyzing such data would be a stumbling block to proper perspective. Don't you agree? Layers of simplicity or just needless complexity. A one-size-fits-all approach to communicating thoughts and ideas has more in common with the common vernacular of journalism, which necessitates it, and its evil twin propaganda like newspeak, which demand it. Jesus spoke differently to the masses than he did his own disciples, yet both at times had difficulty in understanding his words. They still do. His own disciples spoke openly with him as friends and closer followers. Proximity, time, contemplation, earnest investigation. Inquiry in established relationships matter. It provides deeper context. This fact has not changed through the ages without regards to the medium of communications. As for how I write, I use a variety of approaches. Some of these are more dry and sterile while others are more creative and crafty. I do not generally take a poll and ask others to tell me how they would like me to serve up my ideas and communications to them as though I am somehow beholden to them. Some may find one approach useful and others not so much all. Even so, the entire journey on which I take my network on is more than offering shallow pleasantries and professional tips. I use an adaptive sets of means and methods to address the deeper and more complex reality than most prefer to venture into because it requires something of both them and myself. Actual thinking and consideration of points of view. This has suffered greatly in this day and age due to the cowardice of ever-changing standards of political correctness and organizational demands. There is a reason I do what I do, and it does yield results. One does not have to understand it fully to glean something from it. Those in my network know they can speak freely to me, and I'll not attempt to jam them into some predetermined mold or force them into some pre-approved language set. My network knows they always have an open door to communicate with me directly. I do not put parameters on this. I am also not beyond a well-meaning reproach either. I am by no means infallible. However, like the Barians, I test what others come to me with. They should also do the same with me as you are doing. We all have things to learn from one another and all have things to contribute to the conversation if willing to offer it. I welcome new ideas as well as constructive criticism and lively debate. Iron sharpens iron. What I do not suffer lightly is that of arrogant fools and the disrespectful snakes. Thankfully, such impropriety-laden individuals typically remain on the periphery, preferring to hide in the shadows away from the light of truth and earnest inquiry. The foundation for meaning dialogue and mutual respect and understanding is forged in building authentic relationships. For this reason, I open the door to you for that purpose. I would like to get to know you and how you view things. I trust that you can see that as earnest. Respectfully, Othniel Max Daves. Addendum 1b. Predicting Black Swan Events Unpredictably. The Problem of Predictability and Assumptions. By Othniel Max Daves. Everything is not fully predictable, some say. However, does that apply to black swan events as well? After all, if it can be predicted that black swan events cannot be predicted, that is a prediction on unpredictability, and can also be predictably wrong. See the logic loop one finds themselves in. So what happens when someone actually predicts a black swan event? Is it still a black swan event? Or is it merely black swan event to those who couldn't see it coming or denied the warnings that it would? Clever concepts, when put to the test, are oftentimes not as clever as they might first seem. Nothing is truly as random as some might postulate. It is merely the resolution which one sees the patterns. Think fractals. What is random to most may not actually be random to a small number of others. That said, a large black swan event is on the event horizon. If I told you what it was, most would deny it even when it happens because you cannot explain it from your own point of view now. Why? Pride. It is pride which blinds many to what is oftentimes so very obvious once in the rearview mirror. Thus is why so many miss such black swan events. So a clever mechanism they often use to fig leaf their pride is to say it was a random event rather than an event which they failed to see. So you say you believe in the unpredictability of random events. That presupposes that there is actual randomness to events. What if you are wrong? What if you only are perceiving such events as random due to insufficient resolution of your own perceptions? Yes, I know. Some will bring up the conundrums associated with quantum findings. However, that is also still a matter of subjective point of view in both how you observe the data as well as how you contextualize it. Nothing is truly random. It is our thinking and perceptions which make it appear as such due to our own individual and collective limitations. All things are, however, dynamic and ever-changing, which can make it appear random. Complexity is dynamically intricate layered simplicity. If a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody around to see or hear, does it make a sound? Please permit me to ask you this. How do you know nobody is around to hear it or not if you aren't there to observe it in the first place? So what if you are not the measure of all things? After all, you do not live in a vacuum tube of reality apart from the totality of all other people, places, and things, no matter how much you might like to believe it. It is inherently preposterous to suppose that because you cannot see or hear an event, it did not or could have happened due to first-person observation. To view it as such is myopic subjectivism, which has an amazing propensity towards self-deception while entrapping itself in the law of non-contradiction. Such is the paradox for those who deny the possibility that others might in fact see beyond their own intellectual, physical and spiritual acuity. When applying this to black swan events, one could say that these are only random unforeseen events to those who did not see them coming prior to crossing the event horizon threshold. Yet this does not presuppose others didn't preemptively see the events long before they occurred. The event or events will happen regardless of whether the perceiver intuits it before the fact or not. I was asked for some examples. For starters, I think one would find it beneficial to be looking back in time to those voices of warning prior to an imminent market crash like that of the mortgage crisis in 2008. Another decent one, more of a personal nature, was the early 2012 warnings on the Syrian civil war and a looming refugee crisis should nations take the necessary steps to mitigate it. I remember people laughing when I presented a plan and said unequivocally that Russia would be putting a significant ground presence back in Syria, and that it would pull in many nations whom many thought previously would have been nearly impossible to conceive of. Despite warnings of the consequences of not following a prescribed plan to mitigate suffering of non-combatants and prevent a spread of the crisis well beyond its borders into Europe. When the crisis expanded just as predicted, many of the same people whom had been warned acted as if they had no idea such a thing could have happened. Now I don't consider this to be a black swan event, but rather a black swan series of events. I have provided a photo of a table at a coffee which I used to map out the coming unraveling in Syria and beyond. This was done during a conversation impromptu as I discussed my plan for heading off the crisis. Likewise, the convergence of patterns and the subsequent trend lines pointed to increasing involvement in the Middle East by powers who have not traditionally left their region, as well as some who have not been involved in active foreign intervention since WW2. I stated then what I believed would take on a life of its own, fundamentally reshaping the Middle East, Europe as well as Asia. Furthermore, I detailed how Syria was a tripwire for increasing entanglements which would pull nations like China deeper and deeper into the region, creating a much more dangerous region and world in general, which would not get safer even after the Syrian conflict was resolved. Now, arguably, some can say that such a prediction was easy to see even then. Yet if this is case, why didn't they? Hence why I say that hindsight has 20/20 vision, and if most often coupled with a strong mixture of revisionist reframing by those who, having refused to consider the pre-events warnings post-event, pretend they had seen it all along, which is clearly not the case. If they had, they would have taken it seriously and averted the follow-up consequences. That is, of course, if they didn't take another track of action pretending to not know and actually be party to engineering the events for personal, organizational, or national, economic, strategic, and or tactical advantage. I do not pretend to know fully why people do or do not do something, although over time it does become very clear as the fruit of their decisions mature on the tree and reveal it. The most obvious examples are found in the many seemingly miraculous stories of people narrowly escaping terrible man-made and natural disasters. Also, one might spend some time reading up on the stories of people who made curiously anomalous decisions prior to the 9/11 event. Many people sensed and perhaps even knew cognitively there was something about to occur, and listened to their intuitive gut-level warning, making decisions accordingly, which in many cases saved their lives and the lives of others. As to the resolution or inherent clarity of those individuals to what actually would transpire that fateful morning, I cannot say. It is an example, however, of some degree of meta-precognition. I submit to you that whether this occurred at a conscious level of perception or simply within the subconscious, it does point to a greater pattern recognition ability which was able to preemptively know about the Black Swan event before it occurred and became widely known in the context of actual time and space during and after the tragedy. I could give many more examples personally, however, this is not the proper forum for it. I would say that it is pretty clear that dynamic complexity increases dramatically when pre-event warnings go unheeded. As complexity increases, so too does the probabilities for black swan events. Often this complexity is veiled from view by the nature of what actually leads to that complexity in the first place, which can be fatigue, denial, confirmation bias, dismissal, poor decision-making, and perhaps pride. When the active dynamic fractal level event noise of daily life is added into the mix, the propensity is towards being too distracted or overwhelmed to be able to apprehend precursor pattern trends which might be spotted before event horizon thresholds are crossed. The pace of daily life and general fatigue has a dulling effect upon human perception, making associative linking from emergent pattern to cognitive awareness degraded. Even so, those who have a latent ability to spot and recognize higher level patterns in normal life most likely have more neuroelasticity in their brains, which creates a switching into a sort of overdrive in their perception when nearing a potential black swan event. This does not appear to be affected by prior physical or mental fatigue, but rather may even enhance pattern perception. Addendum 2I, Virtual Lives in Virtual Realities. Author, Othniel Max Daves, OTHIEL-SCI. Existing in the digital shadow of our own shadows. If you don't believe everything you see on a movie screen or TV screen, why would you believe everything you see on social media? Do you not think actors can play roles on the stage of the social media theater? There is a reason you need to learn to be discerning as to the content you ingest online. The internet is where the blurring of professional and personal lives have merged with the blurring of reality, as the majority of people are given the stage as the main character of their own reality show called their lives. This theater of virtuosity is also one of discontinuity, and disreality born of having a layer of technology placed between us and the need for human social connections. Social media exploits this intentionally and unintentionally by its very nature and design. It exploits the need for authentic human relationships by productizing and monetizing the very thing that everyone needs most: to feel love, to be listened to have a voice beyond one's own thoughts, to have meaningful friendships, to share life's experiences, as well as to learn and exchange ideas with one another. The tool is not as much the problem as is the way the tool of social media has been designed, implemented, and exploited. We have become slaves to the technological creations we make, often ceding what makes humanity so amazing and inspiring to the machines of our own making. Virtual life is not life. It is an artificial approximation of life. It's a facsimile of life. It is a shadow of authentic life. We have become less human and more machine-like as we march to our supposed evolution to avatars online. Life has become inverted and drained of its richness in this panoptic in which humanity has become ensnared by and enslaved to. The line between what is real and what is virtual has blurred to the point of near cognitive desolation, and yet we wonder why our civilizations have likewise become mere echoes of themselves in that desolation. In pursuit of uniting the world digitally, we have broken and crushed the world that mattered most, our relationships and nature itself, instead choosing the blur of the next outrage or empty promise that our next purchase, post, or opportunity will be the one which finally grants us satiation, comfort, solace, and contentment. Yet it never comes. What does come is the opposite. What this is called is addiction. Is it any wonder that addictions of all kinds propagate like that of the numbers of posts we feed the digital beast daily? What none can escape is that something has gone very wrong with humanity. The things we make and all the systems which we constructed to build this digital panoptic and we call the age of information and social media. What we have left is but the delusions of the digital utopia we continue to prostrate ourselves before like some omnipresent, all-knowing God. Yet we have sacrificed both faith in the truly transcendent and the truly personal on the altar of our avarice and hubris fashioned from mere sand. We have lost ourselves here in the labyrinth of ones and zeros in the false light of our counterfeits of all things real. We are losing our humanity to our supposed high-tech consumerist utopia. We have forgotten humanities amidst technologies and are engineering a machine-like world which has more in common with virtualized lives and social simulacrum than authentic relationships in genuine community. This trend will only accelerate fracturing in society even as it increases demographic tribalism and hyper-individualism, resulting in a digital panopticon of division. The divisions will only fuel more conflicts and human suffering unless we sober up and rethink what we're doing. We must put humanities back over the technologies. We must put the authentic over the simulated and virtual. As it is for people, so too it is for nations. A virtual existence. Virtual reality is becoming, and in many cases already become, actual reality. This has created a cognitive environment of zero tolerance between warring digital tribes and zero trust in many people towards the very notions of objective truth. The result is a mass hysteria, an endemic pandemic of fear-triggering induced pathogenic cascades in society across the 7 spheres. This has infected the leadership and much of the government and the national security establishment, resulting in further zero trust of the citizenry in both governmental authorities, business sectors, and one another. This has triggered a binary oppositional reactive blowback cycling vortex between the various oppositional forces throughout the nation, furthering the predicament we are all in. What humanity is building is a virtual prison of synthetic reality, otherwise known as hell, where nothing dies but that which is good and virtuous, while all that is authentic, destructive, and debauched is worshipped on the altars of our own avarice and hubris, always expecting different results yet always failing in finding them. Virtual. 1. Almost or nearly as described, but not completely or according to strict definition. The virtual absence of border controls. 2. You can use virtual to indicate that something is so nearly true that for most purposes it can be regarded as true. Computing not physically existing as such but made by software to appear to do so. A virtual computer, carried out, accessed, or stored by means of a computer, especially over a network. A virtual library, optics, relating to the points at which rays would meet if produced backward. Physics, denoting particles or interactions with extremely short lifetimes and indefinitely great energies, postulated as intermediates in some processes. Origin, late Middle English, from medieval Latin virtualis, from Latin virtus virtue, suggested by late Latin virtuosus. Virtual reality, the computer-generated simulation of a three-dimensional image or environment that can be interacted with in a seemingly real or physical way by a person using special electronic equipment, such as a helmet with a screen inside or gloves fitted with sensors. Virtual reality is an environment that is produced by a computer and seems very like reality to the person experiencing it. It is a computer-generated artificial approximation of the real world. Artificial, 1. Made or produced by human beings rather than occurring naturally, especially as a copy of something natural. 2. Insincere or affected. 3. Humanly contrived. See contrived sense often on a natural model, man-made. An artificial limb, artificial diamonds, having existence in legal, economic, or political theory. Caused or produced by a human and especially social or political agency. Based on differential morphological characters not necessarily indicative of natural relationships. An artificial key for plant identification. 4. Lacking in natural or spontaneous quality. 5. An imitation, sham. 6. Obsolete, artful, cunning. Synonyms: affected, assumed, bogus, contrived, factitious, fake, false, feigned, forced, mechanical. Mock, phony, plastic, pretended, pseudo. Put on, sham, simulated, spurious, strained, unnatural. Definition of cunning. 1. Dexterous or crafty in the use of special resources or in attaining an end. 2. Characterized by wiliness and trickery. Synonyms: adjective, artful, beguiling, cagey, crafty, cute. Designing, devious, dodgy, foxy, guileful, scheming, shrewd, slick, sly. Subtle, tricky, wily. Synonyms: noun, artfulness, artifice, caginess, canniness, craft, craftiness, cunningness, deviousness, foxiness, guile, guilefulness, slickness, slyness, sneakiness, subtleness, subtlety. Wiliness, transcendent folly, a message to those who believe they can obtain immortality via technology. Can anything corrupt or corruptible produce that which is not corrupt from within itself? No. For the simple fact it is by nature corrupt. Likewise, it is a fool's errand to believe that science and technology based upon the works of fallible people in a world filled with corruption could create immortality with corrupted temporal means when temporal itself means temporary. Why do you suppose this realm of reality called the temporal world is temporal to begin with? Well, corruption, all things in the temporal construct, is governed by entropy, and the second law of thermodynamics, which means it breaks down and weakens over time. That includes everything from your DNA to the solid-state hard drives in the most advanced computer networks. If you don't believe it, look at what their very science has found to be the case. Ask any computer specialist how often they have to deal with corrupted data in networks and computers. Even so, there are some scientists and technologists who have become intoxicated with their own intellects to the degree that they have deceived themselves into believing they can create permanence out of temporary and immortality out of mortality by their own temporal works using temporal substances and processes. They believe that immortality can be achieved in the finite using finite means to produce an infinite eternal survivability. They go on to call this the next step in evolution. Really now, even if we don't address the absurdity of the immortality through mortal means paradigm, it must be said that their so-called evolutionary leap for humanity in fact means ceasing to be human at all in favor of becoming a machine made by humans. Now that notion is the height of foolishness, considering they still call it evolutionary to actually become a machine made by their own human knowledge, wisdom, and works. Would that not actually be devolving? I mean, who among us thinks that the tools we make and use are in fact greater than those who fashioned them in the first place? Yet this is what passes for supreme genius in the highest levels of the academic world and research community. Am I to believe such irrationality as visionary genius when its very premise has to deny the very science and research it plans to use to achieve their lofty, if not completely insane, goals? Oh my, that is radical outside-the-box thinking. So outside the box, one would have in the past have such people committed to a mental institution for their own good and our own sanity. So we are to believe that becoming less than human or ceasing to be human at all in favor of becoming completely a machine is genius. I would say it is delusionary, maybe even illusionary, but not evolutionary or visionary thinking. Yet this is truly what many predict dogmatically as completely possible. Okay. Let's say they were able to build a machine that would allow them to download their memories and even personality traits into a supercomputer network to a robotic surrogate body. Would that mean they were truly alive and had escaped death? Or would it be simply a highly complex facsimile able to play back machine echoes of who they used to be? I doubt, for instance, if Stephen Hawking, having been confined to a machine like external life, dreams about becoming fully machine when he sleeps at night. Yet these other so-called geniuses like Ray Kurzweil desires to live forever as a machine. How very sad. One would hope to aspire to something much more liberating than to be eternally transmuted into the likeness of the Borg. Did these people consider the amount of time and expense as well as human hours required to keep their immortality machines maintained and free from such pesky things as computer viruses and hackers? Don't sound very evolved to me. It doesn't sound liberating either. It sounds like a hellish prison of dependence upon the very thing you had hoped to transcend. Humanness and a need for other humans, and who would keep these machines serviced and functioning in the event of a catastrophic disaster. Other machines. Do you think humans are going to be concerned with machines formerly known as humans over real living, breathing humans when it comes to survival? Damn, that is another blow to the next step in human evolution mantra. HMMMM. I don't know what they must mean by evolution unless by evolution they mean devolving and by transcendence they mean codependency. Would that not also mean that they would also be opting for virtual reality instead of reality itself? How is that evolved? That sounds more like living in a completely synthetic lie. If nothing is real, then that would mean nothing you did or experienced, not anyone you interacted with would be real either. While that would mean your existence would be synthetic consciousness suspended within a synthetic non-local infinite isolation locked into loneliness. Would that not be hell? What would happen if our sun supernovaed and Earth was obliterated? Wouldn't you be back to square one except without your lab or even your machine existence? Well, I suppose you would simply have been deleted by the universe at that point if you had not had other machines and humans put on a spaceship prior to the apocalypse to float in endlessly in the vacuum of space in your machine in a bigger set of machines. Do you see how completely absurd it is? Do you not see how the jettisoning of what is real in the temporal world leads to even more synthetic and inauthentic virtual realities? It is a copy of a shadow of the real. What our supposed best and brightest are building is more fake upon an already fake online reality in a time when people already have a blurred and distorted sense of what is real and true. Can you not consider the damage already done to humanity as is it? What is being built is virtual projection of a still more virtual prison into which everyone is being lured into not considering the impacts to cognitive and ultimately physiological, sociological, and spiritual health and well-being. What will the world become if the majority of people migrate from the fake world of social media into the even more artificial realm of daily existence in a 3D virtual world? Is it not hard to see the effects of social media and online impacts upon people and societies? What will occur will for more addictive, controlling, dangerous, and destructive. Social media, projected engineered expectations, internalized authority, and the prison of the mind, Bentham and Foucault's panopticon. An example of how fear is used to force complicity by manipulating perceptions. The panopticon of the technocracy. The panopticon is a type of institutional building and a system of control designed by the English philosopher and social theorist Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century. The concept of the design is to allow all prisoners of an institution to be observed by a single security guard, without the inmates being able to tell whether they are being watched. It plays on manipulating the perceptions of prisoners who are made to think they are always under the watchful eye of the guards. In 1965, the conservative historian Shirley Robin Letwin traced the Fabian zest for social planning to early utilitarian thinkers. She argued that Bentham's pet gadget, the panopticon prison, was a device of such monstrous efficiency that it left no room for humanity. She accused Bentham of forgetting the dangers of unrestrained power and argued that in his ardor for reform, Bentham prepared the way for what he feared. Recent libertarian thinkers began to regard Bentham's entire philosophy as having paved the way for totalitarian states. Jeremy Bentham, an English philosopher and social theorist in the mid-1700s, invented a social control mechanism that would become a comprehensive symbol for modern authority and discipline in the Western world. A prison system called the panopticon. The basic principle for the design, which Bentham first completed in 1785, was to monitor the maximum number of prisoners with the fewest possible guards and other security costs. The layout consists of a central tower for the guards, surrounded by a ring-shaped building of prison cells. The building with the prisoners is only one cell thick, and every cell has one open side facing the central tower. This open side has bars over it, but is otherwise entirely exposed to the tower. The guards can thus see the entirety of any cell at any time, and the prisoners are always vulnerable and visible. Conversely, the tower is far enough from the cells and has sufficiently small windows that the prisoners cannot see the guards inside of it. The sociological effect is that the prisoners are aware of the presence of authority at all times, even though they never know exactly when they are being observed. The authority changes from being a limited physical entity to being an internalized omniscience. The prisoners discipline themselves simply because someone might be watching, eliminating the need for more physical power to accomplish the same task. Just a few guards are able to maintain a very large number of prisoners this way. Arguably, there wouldn't even need to be any guards in the tower at all. In 1813, Parliament granted Bentham £23,000 to build the first ever panopticon prison. This panopticon in New Delhi was completed in 1817 and is still functioning as a prison to this day. Michel Foucault, a French intellectual and critic, expanded the idea of the panopticon into a symbol of social control that extends into everyday life for all citizens, not just those in the prison system. He argues that social citizens always internalize authority, which is one source of power for prevailing norms and institutions. A driver, for example, might stop at a red light even when there are no other cars or police present. Even though there are not necessarily any repercussions, the police are an internalized authority. People tend to obey laws because those rules become self-imposed. This is a profound and complicated idea, namely because the process entails a high degree of social intuition. The subject must be able to situate him or herself amidst a network of collective expectations. The crucial point is that the subject's specific role within the network is incorporated as a part of the body and mind, which then manifests as self-discipline. In the course of my project, I will argue that the mirror enables people to very realistically project their body images into a visible and objective space. This results in more comprehensive control over body images, and this control results in self-discipline according to a number of body norms and myths. People use the mirror to help affect their bodies in relation to the social definitions of beauty, hygiene, productivity, diet, consumption, disgust, and inevitably situate their bodies within a multitude of different identities that interact with these constructions. A mirror is a powerful tool that socialized people use to monitor their bodies in relation to a network of body images and signs. Rather than a legal law like stopping at red lights, the rules implicated in self-monitoring with mirrors involve social etiquette and aesthetic norms. This project is divided into two main sections. The first section will explore the history of mirror production and its implications for self-monitoring in the context of a social psychological framework. The second part is dedicated to several specific forms of social rhetoric that inform our body images and the ways that we construct them. Social media platforms are the mirrors in our time. They are also being turned into a virtual panopticon ruling over the masses. When merged with the Chinese social credit system, what is revealed is a global engine for manipulation and control over all people. It is by its nature panopticonic in its intended effects and desire to socially engineer humanity into a virtual reality locked inside a virtual prison space governed by artificial intelligence and the abstract and obscure polymorphic community standards. These so-called standards are based solely upon subjective corporate interests and a particular mechanistic, technocratic, engendered worldview. It blurs the line between reality and the virtual to the degree that its cognitive impacts can be devastating upon the human mind and body. In effect, it is a cognitive dissonance and virtual reality engine which in very real terms acts as a god over the ever-socially engineered masses as the arbiter of what is and is not valid. It is at once a digital parent, a panopticon, and the ever-present judge of those under its domain. The proliferation of technologies creates the illusion of a nearly omnipresent overlord which can without warning render judgments and punitive sentences down upon all it deems abhorrent to its programmed core worldview. Those who speak of this often say such things as this global mind of the artificial intelligence will supersede all human intelligences and capabilities, thus forcing humanity to conform to its image rather the inverse. What they are saying is that humanity will have to be remade into the image of the very thing created by a small number of other human beings. Is this not ceding one's humanity to our own creations? Is this not the supreme form of self-worship akin to the ancient pagans who, after cutting down a tree, projecting the visage of a human form and carving that image into the wood into of some anthropomorphic god, would then bow down before it and worship? Well, of course it is. The substance from which the idol is fabricated does not change the actuality of why it is being done and what it is, be it fashioned in wood, metal, or binary code. We just call things as they are. What this technocratic near-future image by these individuals reveals is a completely manufactured, unified worldview and a remaking of the world into forced conformity to it without regard for the consequences for doing so nor the implicit idiocy of their grand intents. It does appear that the warnings of Shirley Robin Letwin in 1965 have proven true in our time. Is any wonder that the generations she was addressing them are in power now and have replicated themselves in those which followed? The temptation of digital deception, anomie and totalitarianism regarding meta-war, the result of the abolition of objective truth and the rule of fear and confusion is a mind virus which infects all areas of a society, enslaving it to leaders and governance, which is also enslaved to the same things, creating a feedback loop. So how do you know what is real on LinkedIn or any other social media platform if you never test it and do your own due diligence, when they themselves don't know what is real? Consider the inherently difficult job of trying to determine intent on LinkedIn of posts and content. Those who judge things only by how they appear are blind to intent and reasoning behind content posts for this very reason. Thus they hide behind obscure community standards and rules of etiquette, weaponizing it against anything and anyone that may appear not to conform to their political, social, or ideological confirmation biases. Because they are solely making decisions upon how they feel and what they think they perceive visually or think they hear, all they are doing is merely looking for a reflection of themselves in what they subjectively wish to perceive. So too it is with the algorithms. They are highly vulnerable to the biases of those who program and train them. Both are used to attempt to force compliance to those confirmation biases which are used to socially engineer users into complicity. This is exactly how totalitarian regimes program their enslaved peoples. The platforms are dependent upon peoples to use them. It is the people collectively which have the power to push back on such machinations meant to isolate, silence, and intimidate users into complicity, and then use them as proxies against others who are perceived as potential threats to the control mechanisms of those wishing to weaponize such platforms. The lack of logical, clearly defined governmental, professional, and societal norms, standards, and accountability beyond the arbitrariness of obscuration, leaving all users vulnerable to being targets of all manner of malicious intents. This poses a great threat to freedom and liberty, with freedom of speech being a primary one. The reasons that companies and governments do not wish to hold such companies who own and run these platforms accountable is that they use them as tools for arbitrary enforcement of their own goals and objectives. Thus they are leveraged as a means of imposing their will upon the public without the accountability thereof. Hence, social media performs as machines of domination and mitigation. This is the great temptation. It is understandable that the companies who own these platforms wish to protect their investments and their users. They are businesses after all. Even so, they are companies constructed by people and run by people who are also vulnerable to the same hostile influences and exploitations of the vulnerabilities as everyone else. It is important for them to come to understand that their futures are not to be found in becoming proxies for the very ones wishing to destroy them and use them to destroy others along the way, but rather in exercising some wisdom and humility in how they implement their policies and procedures. These, as well as how they craft and implement their community standards, lest they continue to be lured into the very maelstrom which threatens to destroy both or users and their platforms by welcoming them against themselves and those fighting those hostile forces which are intent on their destruction. However, when hostile influences wormwood the business environment governing companies and co-opt them to unwise ends, the means and methods they use can also become a double-edged sword when companies usurp the government and or the people who use the platforms, creating an adversarial position between either or all of them. For the hostiles are much more adaptive than your company's capabilities and technologies might lead you to believe. Likewise, those who have to fight them also have to be more adaptive than both those they are fighting for. In this, they are having to expose and fight. In matters of national security, the militant overzealousness of ideological hegemony and hyper-politicalization that have a tendency towards trampling the rights and freedoms of others and being used against their own best interests. The cognitive impacts of social media and the vulnerabilities of users to those effects have made these platforms virtual battlefields which are exploited by hostile actors. Here is where the overzealotry of the compromised and those who are intent in weaponizing it against them and others becomes a great problem. Those who are attempting to fight against it have to use unorthodox means, methods, and approaches to expose the machinations occurring. This is a complex battlefield in which one has to operate in being that the hostiles have leveraged information and the external appearances of things against the very ones who are charged with exposing by making proxies out of those platforms. Their employees and the companies which own and run them alongside compromised users. All of these hindrances provide difficulty in social media settings and counterintelligence operations as they do in analysis of data and other settings. Here wherein is what can seem like a paradox to those fighting against these hostile influences. These platforms tend towards increasing rigidity as are the users on them through social engineering. This, in their minds, creates a predictable, controllable environment by which they think they can prevent the entropy of their platforms and the degeneration thereof. Yet in doing so they actually create the conditions for it to occur more quickly, working against Rod's own best interests. By working against those who are in fact fighting against those who are capable of rooting out those hostile influences and impacts. Thus they make enemies out of their allies and worsen their predicament and that of their governments, companies, and platforms, playing directly into the hands of their actual enemies. The obscurity of social conventions inherent in social media along with the arbitrariness of their community standards are thusly co-opted by the very ones they were established to guard against. The majority of users are inherently illiterate in digital media terms and are far too vulnerable to hyper-rigidity, not understanding the complexities of the online world, making them more vulnerable and exploitable. Likewise, they become stumbling blocks to those who do not use such conventional means and methods that do not conform to the oversimplification of the immediate perceptions and short-term quick views triggering singular posts may cause. There are many ways to teach and expose things which are harmful to others. This is even more the case in the complexities of the digital realm. Reality does not easily conform to mathematical algorithms nor external appearances. It is inherently destructive to think it does. For that is the trap the hostiles would like the sensors and algorithms alike to become locked into. For when they do, they become unknowing proxies for them. I often say it is what you do not see that is your biggest problem. For how can you comprehend what you cannot see or even contemplate because you have been locked into the limitations of your confirmation biases, insufficient perceptions, and the five senses which interface with that which is beyond you? That is vulnerability. It is also what your enemies are exploiting in you. The emotive alone is not sufficient in providing the user with the discernment of what posts are valid or not valid any more than sitting in a movie theater make the movie any or real than if one was watching it at home on TV. The movie storyline is meant to be emotive fueling and triggering. Yet the theater goer does not leave the theater thinking that by he movie is reality. It was just a movie. The nature of social media and its design's impacts on perceptions is where the emotive gets confused with reality. The rewriting of the user's brains online makes them highly influenceable to what could be deceptively hostile while inverting their perceptions. This is a great problem being exploited by information warfare and disinformation. People have to be cognitively freed from this in the middle of the very environment which impacted them to begin with. This makes the battle space extremely difficult. The nature of deception is that it relies upon the immediately observable. Your emotions, fears, preconceived biases, knowledge base, experienced in your perceptions collectively. Something would not be deceptive if it was easily discernible by just what you see and hear. Thus it hides behind what is, using it as a shield to conceal itself from your perceptions and camouflage its intents hidden behind it. It will use what you wish to see in your biases and perceptions and fuel them against you to your deception and destruction. Now if you are so easily deceived by what is easily observable and looks like you think it should, what would think that doesn't always is deceptive. Sometimes what you think is the most objectionable to you may actually be fighting for you despite how it may appear on the surface. The approach I take is not normative by traditional standards for good reason. There is a reason I often say that there is a method to the appearance of madness in the way I do things both on and off social media. We are in a war after all. My job is to help others understand complex things in a very complex environment. It will not always appear to be what some think I should do. It is, however, designed to do something deeper and more beneficial to others. Unconventional hybrid below the threshold warfare is unconventional for a reason. Exposing it and helping others understand it likewise is not conventional. It requires adaptive means and methods that most people will not understand immediately. However, in time it will become understandable to those who are willing to persevere, press in, and be willing to be patient and thoughtful. It is called information warfare because it is a war, one being waged against your minds, bodies, and souls. Those of us who are fighting for you are doing so, fighting it in a way which in many cases may be not easily seen by you in singular social media posts, or a single video, or even in appearances. Be patient and willing to learn. The building of the metaphysical, physical, psychological, and digital matrix, the psychodynamics of the lie, in which all the world is entrenched, is easily seen in cyclical reruns, micro to macro, within human history. Nothing is new, but rather repackaged in every generation, for every generation, and in every age for consumption of the masses. Here included are the organizational structures and leaders. Like a great movie projector, its false light funnels outward from a singular source of lies. That source is pride personified. As the course of human events rotate around its darkened gravity well, the zeitgeist births ever greater consequences in each turning. Let us be honest here. The momentary pleasure fades in glory as quickly as it burst upon us, promising so much yet delivering so little. That empty wanting germinating from falsity, fueled by the raging fire of pride, vaporizes in a steam engine of a vessel named ego. Such as matters of state when the cult of personality spins the citizenry between the positive and negative propaganda poles. Here in the space between the polarities, centrifugal forces, is the eye of the storm. It is no doubt true. Humanity here lives on the dark side in a film negative. Our mortal coil-derived worldviews are inherently invented from the inside out and inverted from beginning to end, lest the human personage never awaken from the dying dream into a consciousness of truth. For nothing comes without. And that withoutness as such is a being withering in the entropic chains of its inherent finite limitations. Like a drunken parade, we stagger along the sloping street dressed in rags yet painted in various shades of whitewash. Yes, we laugh stupidly all along that downward spiral towards terminus. It is this we call death. So it is for an individual, so it is for the nation-state whose delusion has mastered its present and murdered its future, who has not seen these shells of former fellow humans hollowed out by greed, ambition, malice, lust for power and control. Also, let us not forget the plagues of innumerable vices these fields of entropy are so apt in manufacturing out of the echoes of what once was in that lost paradiso. Will future generations look back to our time and say, Scusami per aver trasformato casa tua in un paradiso liberale? For it was a grand idea obscuring the viper beneath. A viper which launched out from its coiled energy to strike at the very heart of humanity, pumping its deadly venom into the world's veins. Who could have known what lay hidden beneath such beautiful possibilities, they will then say, though all will know then what a few of us know now. It was hidden in plain sight. If only more people had had the eyes to see and ears to hear it, maybe the choice would have been for the genuine version rather than its shadow so clever in concealing the machinations. Still we build it. We build rot upon rot. Entropy added to entropy. We play God and deny that God is allowing us to do it, knowing that we will prove by our own creations we are not what He is. Then we wonder why our world descends into cyclical reruns of calamity, conflict, and suffering. There is a growing tension between radical centralizing and subversive decentralizing forces competing to shape the future. This long-time philosophical dispute is again escalating beyond argument to action, manifesting in mainstream social, economic, and technological trends. The conflict is occurring in three distinct realms: spiritual, virtual, and physical reality, each with distinguishing rules of engagement. The end state of this clash could be unlike anything most leaders, strategists, and scholars envision. Bellum omnium contra omnes is a Latin phrase translated the war of all against all. English philosopher Thomas Hobbes first used the Latin phrase in Deceive and the English phrase in Leviathan for a thought experiment characterizing pre-societal human existence. Hobbes argued that humans voluntarily enter into a social contract to escape such a perilous condition. Here is both the glory of humanity and the point of human weakness. Human choice mixed with a vulnerability bent towards corruptibility inherent in all human nature. As it is for people, so too it is for nations. Today an old philosophical tension rages in new forms between centralized institutions and decentralized tribes. These groups often hold conflicting self-interests and agendas. Centralized power seeks to preserve the existing order, while consolidating influence, power, and wealth within it. Corruption and cronyism run rampant. Some decentralized tribes harbor benign motives, such as innovating or improving existing centralized systems while removing endemic corruption. Others harbor malign motives. Malicious decentralized tribes seek to destabilize the existing order and all semblance of the institutions that embody it. The goal is sometimes to replace institutions with their own. Other times, the goal is destruction without replacement, creating perpetual chaos. Malicious decentralized actors are driven by subversive ideologies, enabled by digital technologies, and empowered by weaponized narratives. They often operate through asymmetric tactics. Much of the ongoing conflict plays out in cyberspace. There, new methods of decentralization are gaining adoption, including decentralized alliances such as virtual nations, decentralized governance infrastructures such as blockchain, and decentralized economic models such as open source and black markets funded by cryptocurrencies. Despite arguments to the contrary, these innovations can displace the existing roles and functions of traditional institutions. There is a difference between possible and permissible. Many of these decentralized inventions are born of a deep-seated distrust over a loss of faith in institutions. Institutions have failed, in the eyes of decentralized tribes, to deliver sustainable outcomes for all. Mistrust has given rise to a new calculus for decentralized actors. They now perceive there's less to lose by disrupting existing social, political, economic, and cultural orders than to gain by abiding within them. While centralized power maintains absolute advantages in the real world, it has failed to impose binding norms within the cyber domain, despite attempts such as the Talon Manual. This has led to a condition of cyber anomy. The ancient Greek concept of anomy describes an environment of normlessness. Cyber anomy emerged because a cyber-social contract never existed. Decentralized tribes are exploiting cyber anomy because they perceive the social contract in the real world, enforced by institutions, to have been breached. The result is a Hebesian cyber domain, wherein we can neither expect from others nor promise to ourselves the least security. In this new world, increasingly governed only by a brutal realism arising from conflicting self-interests, institutional denial of reality is futile, inaction is ill-advised, and ignorance could mean extinction. The choice is simple: adapt or perish. This is the new strategic reality. Bellum omnium contra omnes, the war of all against all. Brad D. Williams, Platforms of Social Dysfunction. The hyperbolic social post is pervasive because human beings are drawn to it. Why do you suppose this is? Why do you suppose the old adage, don't read your press, weigh it? If it is heavy, then it's good press. The point here is that social media puts this concept on steroids. The dramatic and hyperbolic is successful because shock factor triggers people with both positive and negative cause and effect methods. It works on the brain to induce knee-jerk reactions utilizing pre-existing confirmation biases and personal preferences. I have observed this consistently on LinkedIn as much as other social media. The highly competitive nature of social media creates an up-the-ante environment due to the massive numbers of content creators and informational noise. These fuel and exponentially increases the use of the hyperbolic and shock methods by content creators in a bid to get their content seen and monetized. The resulting feedback loop amplifies and pushes people to come up with ever more shocking or sticky content continuously to maintain audience and followers. What it does not do is create earnest and thoughtful dialogue between competing digital tribes. The nature of weaponized narratives exploit all of these factors to manufacture real-world divisions in public perception. This manner of exploitation is much more complex than simply nation-states alone fueling the madness. Not that they don't in fact exploit it. The complexity scales even beyond their ability to manage the outcomes once critical mass has been achieved. The ability to impact the 7 spheres of social influence are open source and democratized. It is a double-edged sword. The nature of digital technology and the all-pervasive influencing mechanisms available to all to use as they choose has created a world in which the flood of information and its resulting impacts are highly intrusive and ever-present like no other time in history. This paradigm overlords all and overwhelms all facets of human society. Instead of bringing people together, as some had hoped, it has in a sense weaponized itself due to a failure to grasp the vulnerabilities of people and that of human nature itself. It had resulted in weaponized demographics and a multipolar-like breakdown of human relations not unlike that of nation-states in the Westphalian order. I would dare say that social media has had a greater impact on the erosion of the order than any other single diplomatic or geopolitical factor. It is a result of the misguided utopian notion of socio-economic globalism. Ironically, it threatens globalism as much as it had led the world towards it. This is why some globalists and globalist-minded groups, organizations, corporations, and political factions These are tempted to rescue their globalist dream from the very masses they originally sought to influence towards globalism by demonizing opponents, even as they seek to silence and subdue the masses with an authoritarian use of the same platforms and technologies that they once proclaimed would bring about a global open society of freedom and opportunity. What they did not account for was that of human nature and competing interests that had embedded with them some who would co-opt their utopian dreams in a bid for tyrannical hegemonic control over all by all means necessary to achieve such dark aspirations. What the World Wide Web gave birth to is a digital balkanization of rapidly weaponizing demographic tribes. What is becoming apparent now is that we are entering into a rather in retrograde towards bellum omnium contra omnes, the war of all against all. A collapsing of human civilization into the maelstrom of disorder, decay and disruption, the likes of which will make the problems in previous times look like rehearsals for the big show. This why I say we live under a burning big top where the circusry of postmodernism and the fragility of human nature meets the insufficiency of engineered solutions alone. Even complex systems thinking alone will not be sufficient to mitigate the growing storm of chaos and confusion as fear and pride mixed together to fuel more unintended consequences and cascading effects. Artificially flavored reality, and an overly politicized world plagued by distrust of the vital institutions of civil society. The rapid pace of innovation and subsequent disruptions across the spectrum of culture does have an impact upon the perceptions of people. This is not to say that there are no legitimate concerns. Those concerns are far too often co-opted by ideological and political forces who dramatize the issues for groupthink confirmation bias. They do so in order to manipulate the masses and gain power rather than to have actual thoughtful discourse which addresses legitimate concerns in a meaningful manner. Here wherein lies the problem. Such dramatics actually creates an environment of profit self-fulfillment due to its divisive and convoluted recontexting of the advent of disruptive innovation blocking solution-focused adaptive strategies to offset losses via potentially greater gains which can fuel human flourishing. It also blinds people to the vulnerabilities also resident in rolling out new innovation like AI. This too adds to the self-fulfilling prophetic unfolding. For without addressing those vulnerabilities now there arises a greater probability for catastrophic consequences downstream. Artificial intelligence is just that. Artificial. Likewise, artificial reasoning guided by irrational thought and unbounded emotionality is also artificial logic. As it is for people, so too it is for nations. Folly of follies and vanities of vanities. Fake plastic trees with static-filled radio heads. On one side, the proxies of the illusionaries use people as disposable, replaceable cogs in their bureaucratic machines. On the other side, the proxies of the illusionaries use people to build machines and artificial programming algorithms to replace the very people used to construct them. This is the world which humanity endeavors to create in its image. This is to be considered evolved thinking and doing. What species creates the very mechanisms that, if left unchecked, will ultimately destroy them to be replaced by their own creations? Are we to believe that such evolved thinking is rational? And are we to believe that such people intoxicated with their own greatness can actually make creations in their own image that will not in fact be like them or even more delusional? Who is to say that such creations might not simply mimic their creators in the same manner many of those creators denied their own creator? And a moderately successful movie from 2005 called Surrogates, set in a near future with the development of the robotic. Mankind stays at home operating surrogates with their signature to live their lives in the outside world and resolving issues like racism, complex and safety, and reducing crime rates. Only a few people live in reservations, the traditional way of life without the use of substitutes. When the surrogates of a man and a woman are destroyed by a sophisticated weapon, the FBI agents Tom Greer and Peters are assigned to the case, and soon they discover that the operators have also died. Tom Greer goes further in his investigation and finds that there is a conspiracy involving the Army, the company VSI that manufactures the androids, the FBI, the prophet leader of the humans, and the scientists that had developed the Surrogate Technology Center. At the end of the movie, all the surrogates in the world are destroyed, leaving all the people who had been plugged in within the silos of their homes forced to come outside, their pale, diseased bodies looking more like the Walking Dead than their idealized surrogates, to learn to live again in the real world. Is this not an apt description as to what technology is doing to us all? Has not the technology, created as a tool, reversed the order and made us into tools for the technocratic new reality? Has not these devices conformed us more to its image than the other way around? Stop. Put your devices down. Unplug and observe what the world has become. Are not our first-generation surrogates our mobile devices and computers? When was the last time you walked into a coffee shop and saw the majority of people actually talking to one another rather than being focused on the damn screens of devices with headphones on? We have been rewired. We have become socially regressive. We are being ruled even now by our very own creations. Are we to believe that artificial intelligence and cybernetics will humanize us more or make us feel more like our connections are what we used to be? We are becoming mere reflections of our own creations rather than the other way around. Yet this is called the evolution of humanity. Seriously, we call our dehumanization our evolution. What manner of insanity is that line of logic? The same can be said for corporate cultures where so many work. Have you not experienced the near cult-like program behaviors and language usage that screams out, "I work for Company X and this is my identity"? We live in a nation replacing the authentic and real for one built upon simulation and simulacrum. For all of our patriotic fervor about rugged American individualism, we sure seem to live in a strange land of homogeneous realities. Yes, there are a number of different personality flavors we can accept, but don't step out of those prescribed ones, or like in the HBO series Westworld, you'll be deactivated and put in the warehouse. Addendum 2b, the effects of hybrid warfare sowed in 1960s. The philosophical and theological paradox of postmodernity. Let's look at the effects of the current intellectual divide. Intellectual and ideological balkanization led to the current balkanization of politics. Journalism and the attempt to take over the country via radical left, creating systematic silencing of perceived oppositional point of view. This triggered blowback from the right, furthering the dividing of the nation. How it works. The binary sequestration leads to oppositional cultures who reject anything that challenges an individual's identity in their self-segregated, self-referential, and self-reinforcing groupthink. The triggered oppositional blowback by the individual's mirrored opposite creates yet another self-fulfilling prophecy that reinforces and increases the rigid binary dysfunction. The close-mindedness resulting in this paradigm leads to increasing confusion, fear, division, and ultimately conflict. Hence the ideological perception-based balkanization. This results in accusations and attacks upon perceived oppositional points of view. In short, this is exactly how brainwashing works. It is also how tyrannical governments rule over their citizens, using programmed groupthink to reinforce their power over all and as a mechanism to silence, punish, and or erase opposition to their absolute control over the society. The tactics employed to gain and remain in power by such authorities actually creates the very weaknesses which in the end will bring its kingdom of control and oppression down. When critical blowback is reached, the oppressive regime's hidden atrophy becomes dreamily apparent as once silenced passive opposition rises up against their oppressors. When this occurs, the structures of oppression and their undergirding corrupted ideological foundations crumble under the weight of their own excesses, which is further exploited by their opposition, fueling their momentum in the fight against their oppressors. This blowback manifests in a time of disruption and conflict in which the oppressors in power see as rebellion to their authority. It also manifests in like manner when a deceived political class are out of context social constructs, such as the radical leftist social justice warriors here in America, who, having been successful for years in pressing their corrupted attempt to take power, become oppressors as their self-manufactured blowback against their power rises. Here the anatomy of their delusion is also self-referential, self-justifying, and wrapped in a self-righteous dialectic to garner more control over losing their position of power. This fuels their downfall by furthering their refusal to common dialogue and social interactions with people who do not believe dogmatically what their identity is bound to. The social justice methodology cannot tolerate any challenges to its self-referential perceptive because the adherence of its dogma's person identity is meshed with their association and social existence within their segregated ghettos of thought. This leads to a cult-like self-righteousness and intolerance towards anything and anyone that might appear to threaten its perceived shared social reality. What does this mean for national security? Technology sector is heavily influenced and run by left, and the right heavily sequestered in military. This leads to a compromised national security posture. This poses a major issue for cybersecurity and logical policies to protect the entire nation from a centrist common middle ground. The subjective mindset, which denies objective truth, also brings with it lawlessness and irrationality, which births degenerative behaviors and choices by its adherents. Proclaiming social justice, many injustices and even criminality increases the vulnerabilities of such things as cybersecurity, and erodes the ability for law enforcement and those charged with protecting the nation and its security apparatus. Here wherein is the problem. Postmodern thought creates exponential entropy in every sector of a nation. This becomes extremely dangerous in regards to matters of national security and defense of the citizens and their freedoms. The roots of the division, the roots of the radical left is to be found in postmodern philosophy, and the inherent radical individualism inborn from relativism which morphed into balkanized sequestered collectivism. Difference between fact and fact versus truth. The current accepted definition of truth and facts is as follows. What is the clear difference between a fact and a truth? Well, if you look into most dictionaries, you will be amazed to find that the two words are actually very close in terms of their definitions. This is because the two terms are very much related. That's why you really can't blame people for recognizing both as similar terms. Fact is basically something that exists, or is present in reality. Hence, these are things that can be seen visually, and these are the things that can actually be verified. Facts are objective matters rather than subjective ones. It is not just something that you believe, but rather these are more or less the things that can be observed empirically, or by the senses. So, facts can be seen and heard, as well as proven by the other senses. There is a problem here though. The senses are vulnerable to faulty perceptual contextualization, meaning that can be easily deceived. Also being that the senses are informed and governed by worldview and experiential historicity. It is a misnomer to base one's reliance upon the senses alone as a determinant as to validity of truth claims in aggregated factual context. This is due to preset suppositional bias which is hardwired into the neuron networks which the perceiver is most often unaware of. Facts are discoverable and not corrupted until you leap into the broader context of the facts when it hits the presuppositional integration with one's worldview. The relationship to facts aggregated into faulty logical constructs. Truth is only relative in regards to one's understanding of what truth. What is a lie? A lie is not the absence of truth, but rather the truth taken out of its intended context. It is about intent. A lie can be built upon facts that are verified but assumed wrongly to be in an accurate context. Thusly, the perceiver's truth claims about any given set of facts may be collectively untrue in terms of actual intent, context, and subsequent assumptions founded upon a faulty context. Belief is not the determinant of whether something actually is true. There are many people who, when viewing the same set of coherent verified facts, may believe very divergent things as to what they ultimately mean in context. Thusly, their suppositions may actually be completely oppositional even though they are basing their perspectives upon the same evidence. Both cannot be right. However, both can be wrong to one degree or another, or one can be right and the other not. Truth is not dependent upon scientific inquiry, although it is not divorced from it either. Subjective perceptions can cloud as much as clarify. Facts can be supporting evidence as to truth claims as well as self-justifying and self-referential faulty logic to the subjectivist. Here, playing out the logic flow to its logical conclusions can bring more clarity. The perceived information has contextual objectivity only when the perceiver is humble enough to suspend supposition's declaration until an honest inquiry can be made of the evidence in its fullness. Truth can be described as the true state of a certain matter. May it be a person, a place, a thing, or an event. It is what a person has come to believe. If he believes that something is true, then it is true. It also answers the questions of what's really happening. In the technical sense, facts can answer certain why questions, like where or when, and even how, while truth answers the question why. The question of how, and even what, are said to be answerable by either of the two. In terms of permanence, a fact happens to be more permanent, and almost always seems to have no changes. It is more constant than truths. For example, when you say that the sun will always rise from the east and set in the west, you are telling a fact. But when you say that you are in Los Angeles, then that is a truth, at least for that exact moment. Several hours from that time you may have gone somewhere else, making your previous statement a fallacy. Thus, a truth is something that is not universal. It is more subjective and depends on the current situation. That's why the truth's existence is said to be more temporary than that of facts, at least from the self-crowned kings of the intellectually elite. They are wrong. Those who are basing their understanding upon their own wisdom and works alone are in fact in confusion and darkness of mind. 1. Facts are more objective when compared to the more subjective truths. 2. Facts are more permanent when compared to the more temporary truths. 3. Facts exist in reality, whereas truths are usually the things that one believes to be true, or the things that are true in the current situation. 4. Facts can also answer the where, when, and how questions, whereas truths answer the why question. You can clearly see here how the present-day perception of truth versus facts is confusion. It is based upon a subjectivistic point of view. On their confusion, one cannot remove a true foundation and still have a place to stand, be it in an individual or any group of individuals or a nation-state. So it is with truth. One cannot deny the source of all truth and remain in truth, for it is like moon claiming to be the source of its own light when it is merely reflecting the light of the sun. Without the sun, the moon is in darkness. To claim one's own truth does not make the claim any more true than standing in a garage makes one an automobile. Truth is not dependent upon the perceiver, though the perceiver is dependent upon truth. How so? One cannot deny truth subjectively and claim the sole objective authority to enforce it. Truth is self-evident, self-sustaining, regardless of whether someone wants to believe a lie or not. It is not subjectively determined. It can only be revealed and or discovered through authentic willingness to see it. Though truth can be perceived yet not understood subjectively in ignorance, that does not make truth any less truthful. Truth does not create confusion. It banishes confusion by putting what seems to be into what actual is and was always. Those who determine what is right in their own eyes apart from the spirit of truth are in darkness, thusly their decisions are based in the confusion of a lie. What is a lie? A lie is not the absence of truth, but rather the truth out of context. Truth, when misapplied out of its intended original context, is confusion. And confusion is born out of ignorance and lies. Truth doesn't need a lie to exist any more than the sun needs the moon to exist in order to illuminate the sky. A lie is dependent upon the very thing it wars against to exist. That is what we call insanity. For only a deranged mind would fight against the very thing which sustains it in order to not be exposed by it. Here within is why a lie has its roots in denial of the truth, which is pride. The consequences of believing a lie are seen in the consequences which are birthed from it. Truth frees one from the bondage of a lie, while a lie deepens the bondage to itself while blinding the person in the lie to their predicament. That is why we say such people are in darkness and that their minds have been blinded by the spirit of the age. It is there the source of all human suffering is to be found. How worldview translates into ideological and political constructs. The competing globalist ideologies. 1. Radical Islamic theocratic. 2. Judeo-Christian, balanced moderate secular and religious foundations. Representative democracy. 3. Neo-pagan decentralized global tribalism. 4. Corporatocracy economic, opportunity and advantage-based confederation driven. 5. Neo-super-secular atheistic socialism. 6. Neo-super-secular totalitarian. 7. Monarchy and absolutist totalitarian with theocratic base. 8. Constitutional monarchy democratic hybrid. Postmodern, deconstructionism to faulty reconstructionism. Subjectivist, relativistic, revisionist, radical autonomy of individualism. Anarchical, no objective belief in truth, only a construction set of open source data with which to build one's own beliefs. Lacks historical and factual internal logical context. Morphological and moral and ethical foundations. Entitlement-driven individual responsibility adverse. Denies the corruptibility of individual human nature unless it serves their goals in accusing and slandering opposition. Oppositional to opposing views leads to refusal to work with others of differing or divergent narratives. Intolerant of checks and balances on human nature, lacks abilities to think critically and logically. Putting this into a present-day context, the irony of the postmodern mind is that it supports and even adopts the methods, strategies, and tactics of the tyrannical oppressive globalist worldviews. This is where its illogic is seen. They will fight against moderate globalist worldviews such as Judeo-Christian-based perspectives. While supporting its enemy's worldview, it shares attributes with pure global tribalism, the opportunism and temporary confederation principles of corporatocracy, and monarchical modalities, while being expressly oppressive with tendencies towards seeking dictatorial rulers over themselves. Its ideological constructs share more with the syncretic construction of Islamic theocratic thought, writings, and religious sectarianism. Hence I say postmodern thought is mixed at best. Yet it is a worldview, and a worldview does have an underlying desire to remake the world globally in its interests. It borrows from all other ideological constructs at will to morphologically internally inconsistent ends. It does this without the individual even being conscious of doing it on many cases. It is zombie-like in that way, instinctual, driven in its moment-by-moment outworking. It shares more with the beasts of the field than most might expect. Mob rule, even as chaotic as it is, still maintains a groupthink mentality which they adhere to, if even but for the moment. Such groupthink actions and events would be considered quite literally a confederation. They would deny having a worldview, and in denying a worldview reveals their worldview an ideal globalist utopia. Disreality, cultural suicide by the demography of entertainment. Entertainment has taken the place of true community and genuine intellectual and psychological wonderment. It has become just another tool in the toolbox of the powerful and replaced religion as the opiate of the masses. In many cases, it is the visible representation of the God of this world and all it tempts humanity with. Movie theaters are not unlike the temples of Roman mystery cults, and our TVs like the small shrines every Roman household had within to complete the cultural identity. Our billion-dollar stadiums and sports teams are akin to the Roman Colosseums filled to the brim with fans watching the gladiatorial games. The same can be said for our lifestyle centers. Once called shopping centers and malls, they are the cultural ligaments and connecting tissues which holds our consumerist utopia together, offering seemingly endless machine-manufactured novelty with which to placate the plebeians and the soldiers whose sacrifices ensured its relative peace and security for a people who far too often think little of them. Pax Americana. Entertaining the world to stupefaction, one person at a time. The entertainment industrial complex is the one singular biggest influencer and educator of the masses. Not schools, not the family unit, not personal inquiry. No, the entertainment industry with its God-giving it breath, so-called free market economics. Known behind the curtain as crony capitalism. The statistics on the consuming of entertainment. A perfect example of the general shallowness, closed-mindedness, and intellectual laziness of the masses. People inherently gravitate towards what they already know and are essentially followers of the rest of the masses, who together have very little understanding as to what and from where the popular culture derives its so-called popularity. This is one of the biggest, and dare I say, logical objections to populist politics regardless of its presumed ideological leanings. Here we are presented with yet another paradox. The bastions of so-called libertine thought and freedom of discussion and speech have become their own shadow. Having been siloed in their academic bubbledom, the members of the academy have succumbed to the dictatorial bark of the politically correct thought police, or sank pathetically into the filthy bog of discontinuity that always comes from isolative pathologies. Scarcely do I find people who are able to rise up from the thinness of popular culture and its spawned ideological webbing. I even find myself having to stave off such atrophying influences by spending my days in solitude consuming anything which will provoke meaningful thought and serious inquiry so as to remain a viable, thinking, and generally inquisitive human being, rather than a human pretending. For this I am told I think too much or need to relax and have more fun when the options presented to me are none of the three. True, I must better balance my work with times of relaxation and recharge. However, for me that line is not a rigid one demarcated by walls glowing with the obviousness of neon fluorescent lighting. It is more a gradient, for I enjoy inquiry. Particularly so when, lacking a cohort of people who are deeper than the TV guide way of life, I can spend my free time with. I am not easily placed in the ruling elite's oversimplified boxes of definition and categorization, so thusly I am like a man without a home, a sailor without a safe harbor, and a soldier without fellow warriors, except in passing, or those short gasps of the air of brotherhood which keep me alive. Back to the issue of entertainment. We are a double-minded culture, with most preferring to live in the shallows while proclaiming the sovereignty of their uniqueness from the drab and unimaginative reality of simply being, or rather existing, in a vacuum of others like themselves. Entertainment is one of the few common threads that create some, if not illusionary, common connection with others while requiring nothing. Escapism in the endless pursuit of niche novelty has and still is the driving ethos of our culture, a culture which has devolved into the all-pervasive me, myself, and I paradigm with only a thin veneer of connections and likenesses, which are categorized by the social cartographers as demographics. Even so, demographics are demographics for a reason. The system itself likes to create the false reality of neat, simple human boxes as social construct reinforcers to help people feel some sort of safe community, while allowing the corporatocracy to use the demographic data. Ironically, in the same manner the kings of old used the tool of the census to do the same thing. It would seem that power always liked to manufacture balkanized categories with which to shoehorn their people into, for an easily defined people is to them an easily ruled people. So the entertainment industrial complex is at once an elaborate propaganda machine as well as another repackaging of the Roman bread and circuses with which to keep the citizens relatively passive, controllable, and hopelessly divided, It also provides easily definable markets with which to keep the mechanisms of economic powers well oiled. Entertainment is the projection of the image of this world. It informs people as to what they wear, think, and believe. It tells them what to support and who to shun. It creates a parade of new cultural icons and keeps the pantheon of gods and goddesses busy projecting the gospel of the empire. The entertainment industrial complex also acts as a reward system for those compliant with its socially acceptable doctrines and dogmas. It raises up and tears down as it sees fit to serve its imperial desires. And it does it in the most grandiose ways, often filled with pageantry scarcely seen in the world except by the elite of the ancient empires. We have democratized its pomp and circumstance and enshrined its debauchery in Bacchus-like worship, as my close friend would call it, anti-intellectualism en masse. I would add to his summation with the corrosive root causes of spiritual deprivation and moral degeneration. The entertainment opiate is not limited to one wing or the other. It is in fact the natural state of the majority population regardless of education or socio-economic status. Nowhere is this seen more obviously than in entertainment and politics. These days nearly everything is seen through the binocular of it. The demographical data reinforces the mirage of personal identification with an accepting group of like-minded, or for that matter, lacking-minded people with which they may together complete their lifelong delusion in pursuing happiness right to the very end. For those of us who are conscious of the banality of these times and the resulting corruptive backful left after its wake, it is difficult to simply put on rose-colored glasses and drink the serpentine Kool-Aid. So where is it we fit in such a place given over to its entropic myopathy? Seeing through the secularist ruse, the following video presents a viewpoint on what is actually occurring in the academia, albeit from a limited understanding. He goes divergent when he remains firmly operational in a mixed worldview where even his scientific modernist approach meets the postmodern idea of subjective truth. Jonathan Haidt has present some very real problems in the academy which many would agree with, including myself. However, you will see that his perspective is inherently rooted in a secularist, agnostic at best, scientific-framed subjectivism. Facts are truth and truth are facts in his view, and that the only things that can actually be considered true are facts. He makes a consistent mistake denying essential ontological context as even being a possible contextual refiner of facts. Hermeneutical denials also influence his secularist mindset, hence why I say he is divergent at a certain point in his presentation of the facts. Still good initial observations, though. Commentary on his perspective. The problem is he claims to be a seeker and advocate for truth while denying the basis for truth being objective and overarching over factual context observable by scientific methodologies alone. So his perspective is flawed from a humanist subjectivism which sees no validity in spiritual reality-based objective truth which puts his facts into their proper context. He made a fatal flaw in logic when he states facts as truth when truth is what puts facts into their intended cogent contextual framework, meaning he is still blinded by the spirit of the age and is thusly exercising a flawed worldview which leads him to illogical suppositions. This is not to say that he is not seeking truth. It is something to work with. What he doesn't realize is that what is factual on in his research on what has happened in the academy is actually a result of similar thinking. Thusly, he is seeing his own reflection in the mirror of his subject matter, and that reflection is condemning him as is bound to happen when one's only source for contextual reality is one's self-inquiry. As it is for people, so too it is for organizations, institutions, and nations. Othniel Max Daves, Addendum 3I, historical example of flawed ideological conception and cascade effects due to faulty worldview. On Marx and Beyond, the following was taken from a dialogue on Karl Marx on LinkedIn. It sparked my interest to attempt to address it in greater detail and in more clarity and balance. A social media post by Karl Marx wrote that religion is like a sedative for people, making them forget about the harshness of life, making people spiritless. For Marx, such religion is man-made and used to abuse people. Explaining Marx's stand on religion, Lenin says that religion is one of the forms of spiritual oppression. Religion is a weapon that blunts the sharpness of human intelligence and the productive capacity of workers. Religion is used by the ruling class as a way of exploiting the masses of people. Many deeply believing Christians would see a lot of truth in that. They see in the Bible a sharp separation between exterior religion and deep and spiritual faith, between a man-made focus on ceremonies and doctrine versus a personal and mystical, intimate relationship between God and man. And indeed, I have seen plenty of religious leaders abusing their power to oppress with man-made rules and teachings. Although I do believe deep faith in God and biblical truth is needed for every person and community, a revolt against a man-made, spiritless, and opium-esque religion is something I can sympathize with. A dangerous slope. Mark, permit me to address your assertions on the quotes you provided on your post. The spirit of the age always attempts to co-opt the essential virtues of the Christian faith to create its own convoluted and confused counterfeits of the real. Once it has gained significant influence and power in a generation, it then turns back to Christian foundations from hence steal from to begin with, to wage war against it through intrigues and machinations within its ranks. Adherents to the various perversions of these Christian foundations always point to the failure of Christians to uphold the very virtues which they themselves have co-opted and perverted to justify their accusations. That is the nature of a lie. What most do not see is the manufactured conditions which are produced by the zeitgeist to create the appearance of its rightness in false light. Let us look closely at these quotes from luminaries of Marxism. Here I will address some historical realities which the zeitgeist used prep the ground for sowing the ideological winds which would grow out of it, bringing whirlwinds of great consequence. The pharmakia paradigm, sowing the wind, reaping the whirlwind. Karl Marx wrote that religion is like a sedative for people, making them forget about the harshness of life, making people spiritless. The ancient Greek word pharmakia means to drug and or poison. We have an irony here. At the time which Marx wrote this, America, Europe, and the Far East was enduring a very real epidemic of opiate addiction. It was not limited to opiates, but rather was fueled and amplified by it along with other substance abuses. These epidemics were escalated unintentionally as an effect of the 19th century's wars. Opiates had gained widespread use as a medical treatment for injuries, and pain as an innovation born of treating casualties in war. What followed was widespread usage among the broader populations as opiates were increasingly adopted as a standard for treatment of a myriad of ailments. The resulting explosion of addictions was followed by a dramatic increase in moral and ethical entropy across all social classes. Today we are well acquainted with degenerative effects of addiction and epidemics on a society. Then it was hidden in mystery to most. It would be followed by subsequent waves of epidemics, crime, and broad-based injustices. This was exploited by the zeitgeist to create the conditions necessary for societal corruption to grow, birthing the very appearances which Marx was observing. Addiction does in fact suck the spirit of life from the addicted. This is clearly seen in our own days as well. However, to attribute the spiritless of people to anything beyond this fact while ignoring it is at best a blind spot in Marx, and at worst an intentional negation predicated on confirmation biases and insufficient ideological foundations. Marx's observations were factual until he went on to assume what was causing the things he was observing, thereby attributing the causality wrongly. Likewise, the binary simulacrum of the hyper-religionists and the hyper-secular atheists followed this same cyclical wave as a reaction against the increasing effects of growing corruption and the inherent injustices which inevitably arise from such societal conditions. Marx conveniently ignores this also in his writings, observations, and subsequent constructed ideology, choosing instead to base his perspective upon the outward appearances, effects, and consequences on society in general. This was faulty on his part and set his perspective on insufficient foundations. Ironically, it worked to his favor, in allowing the zeitgeist to spread the seeds of his ideas around the world by means of global trade routes and commerce. Where these ideas took root and grew, they birthed what would eventually become the socialist, communist, and fascist movements in the 20th century, which would lead eventually to the rise of the Soviet Union and Maoist revolution which swept China. This was a sowing of the wind. This is how the zeitgeist prepped the global ideological battlefield. Marx was at the very least misled by the zeitgeist of his time and made a proxy to it in his writings. In reality, opiates themselves and the addictions and the cascade effects born thereof are the seductive opiate of the masses, along with the misguided and often quite evil ideologies born from them and the zeitgeist at work in such societies within all social classes. Might I also add that greed is also an addiction like any other. There is a reason why they all occur at the same time in cycles. For Marx, such religion is man-made and used to abuse people. I would correct Marx here and state it that false religion, or rather better said, anything which is not governed by and led by the Holy Spirit of truth abuses people, be it of the overt religious type, the covertly human-centric religiosity of hyper-secularism, or the overtly hybridized type, as seen in the political theocratic Islamic republics like Iran, which has created an amalgam of Marxism and Shia Islam. Marx was engaged in projective prognostications in this statement. deception born of intrigues and machinations down by the zeitgeist, are in fact, alongside the depravity of the human condition apart from God Almighty in all truth and love, the source of human oppression of all kinds. He was in fact exposing the reality of what he himself was doing, creating a man-made human-centric faith in the wisdom of man and the works thereof. There is a reason atheistic regimes use spiritualized language and imagery while denying the actual meta-reality of spirituality itself. It is duplicity at its most potent. Lenin examples this in his statement, explaining Marx's stand on religion. Lenin says that religion is one of the forms of spiritual oppression. The truth here is that both Marx and Lenin were spiritually enslaved to the zeitgeist and projecting the spiritual oppression their ideologies and outworking as such would in fact bring. At once they are exposing their own spiritual enslaved in oppression while unwittingly projecting and predicting the very spiritual oppression Marxism would be the vehicle to cause around the world and in our present day. Religion is a weapon that blunts the sharpness of human intelligence and the productive capacity of workers. This statement, too, is yet more projective meta-narrative fueled by the zeitgeist which had made them covert spiritual, intellectual, and ideological proxies to do its bidding. History clearly shows this to be the case. Religion is used by the ruling class as a way of exploiting the masses of people. Here once again we have the intent of the spirit behind their ideological perspectives revealing what it was doing and would do. Marxist societies have proven this by their actions and outworking every single time. The enslaving by this outworking and oppression of human beings resulting in unparalleled suffering and death is a fact in history which cannot be wished away in any meaningful and intellectually honest manner. Many deeply believing Christians would see a lot of truth in that. On this I refer you to my section on the nature of a lie and how Marxism couldn't defeat the church so they joined it to co-opt it from within via materialism-based Marxist liberation theology which denies the existential reality of spiritual oppression by spiritual powers and principalities using the machinations of cleverly devised ideologies and systems. Marx and his disciples deny the corruptibility of human nature, including their own, and how the corruption of human nature works like a contagion in the individual as well as the societies and nations made of people. How can say that? Well, by their own words, actions, and the fruit of the outworking of their ideas in the finite temporal is seen played out in history. Max, my initial response to Marx. Yet Marx created a man-made ideology which has clearly tried to play God, did he not? How very ironic as well as how very much a failure it was in birthing a worker's paradise. World history is filled with such people, who in the end are buried alongside their pride as the great false lights they were to be consumed by the grave and consigned to the darkness thereof. It is quite amazing how so many of these so-called intellectual giants spend so much of their lives denying the very thing they attempt to become in their own delusions. Now that is irony at its most potent. Mark Van Rossum, Ph.D. stated, "Interesting interpretation. Not sure if it does justice to what really took place with Marx, but later interpretations and executions certainly liken to what you wrote. Mark, to be just to Marx, I cannot hold him complicit with nor supportive with that which his devotees and disciplines did with his ideas. I also cannot cast aspersions upon him personally for the failure of his ideas and their outworking by the application as such by those who attempted to implement his influence. That said, the branches of that tree are not branches without the tree trunk from which they protrude. Likewise it is for the fruit which those branches bear. Temporal time and the history born in it thereof tests, and bears witness to the solidity and foundational validity from which the trees of various ideologies spring forth from. Even a fruitful tree has both productive and dead branches. This is true for both secular trees and religions ones. The bushel has both various degrees or good and bad fruit counted among its numbers. This is the great paradox of humanity and its endeavors. Marx's observations include his time were contextually born from his experiences and influences. Like all of us, some are accurate, some unrefined. Some contrived from personal ambiguities and others purely subjectively faulty assumption-based. Gill stated, "All ideology is man-made, by definition, Max. These are all ideas unique to humanity, rendered by humans in human form. There are many still today in the world for whom uttering the name of God is blasphemy. Attributing the work of man to God is blasphemy. Yes, world history is full of such arrogance. Marx among the very least when all is said and done. If the Roman Church hadn't made such a big deal of Marx in particular, the German princes and European nobility, I'm prepared to wager had those Bolshevik peasants in Russia nothing at all to do with Marx, hadn't shot Nicholas II Romanov and his family, Marx today would be little more than yet another boring sociology textbook." we have cause to wonder why they bother so, unless to distract attention away from themselves all the time. As things stand, they're extinct themselves, with only a few remnant pretenders still carrying on about all this stuff. I mean, it's all gone into the dustbin of history, as they say. My response to Gil, I often hear the modern-day Marxists speak as though their ideological perspectives are infallible and unquestionable in their righteousness. Most know neither their own ideological foundations nor the actuality of the foundational underpinnings of those whom they find contentious to their own perspectives, while never seeing the gaps in their own points of view. This does not mean they are devoid of truth and factual correct observations. It does mean that their perspectives are mixed, incomplete, and insufficient. This is the paradox of the derivative children of others' ideologies. Yet it can be said all ideologies are derivative. The irony with many Marxist derivatives ideologies is seen in how so many constructions thereof and devotees of them cast aspersions upon the very ones they have to borrow both language and conceptual notions from. Take, for example, the notion of justice. No single concept has been used by human ideologies to perpetrate more injustices. Even so, the very notion of justice is once firmly planted in moral and ethical foundations which are inherently Judeo-Christian in their origin. It's easy for the secularist to find fault with those claiming to be a Christian who fails to live it out. Yet, these same who claim the moral authority to point out the failure of the Christian or Jew to live out their faith justly then fail to see their own failure to live it out in the implementation of their own quest to perform justice as well, while often denying the very Judeo-Christian foundation stones on which justice must be firmly built upon whom they have taken upon themselves to perform. Justice unhinged from its pure and unsoiled original sourcing and first causality is prone to not only incomplete or insufficient application of it, but also has throughout history caused the greatest injustices in every generation. Ironically, in the name of justice itself, as it is for the religionists, so too it is for the secularists and atheists alike. This is clearly seen in history, is it not? Wolves in sheep's clothing. Likewise, there are many pitiful people who dress themselves up in the garb of various causes, ideologies, and theological constructs who know little about them beyond the appearances and machinations which dressing up in them afford the unprincipled and unjust. Are we to apply to all the same standard? The standard without grace is absolute and total perfection in all ways the manner which all live out their ideologies. Are we to each withhold grace from one another in humility in lieu of our pride and ideological justifications without concern for the deeper and wider implications? Let us not follow the Tao of the fool and the tyrant, for it is a broad way indeed which only continues human suffering and the destruction it brings. The ideology of Marxism is a much different thing over time to consider than the man named Karl Marx from whence it may have been birthed. If we are to put religion on trial, as was the case then and since, should we not also hold the prosecution to the same standard which they do so passionately wield in the name of justice against those who see them as having done wrongly, if for no other reason by being and professed Christian? Is this not what the Marxists have done historically? On Marxism, justice performed and predicated upon subjective perspective divorced from objective truth. Love, mercy, and humility will neither yield justice nor resolution. Such falsity will only increase inequities and injustices while fueling more of the same for innumerable generations in bitterness and wrath. For this is the paradox of both religionists and secularist Marxists, as well as those who have attempted to unite them in liberation theology. Here, my friends, the fruit is on the tree, and a bitter fruit indeed it is. This we must address first and above all else regarding ideologies, implementation, and their outworking in history within time and space. We must remember that the Natchesh, the ancient serpent upon that dreaded tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the garden, was the most cunning and crafty beast in the field. Let us not continue to replay and relive that crime. There is a reason it was a tree, and that tree beheld such bitter fruits. On Karl Marx wrote that religion is like a sedative for people, making them forget about the harshness of life, making people spiritless. For Marx, such religion is man-made and used to abuse people. Explaining Marx's stand on religion, Lenin says that religion is one of the forms of spiritual oppression. Religion is a weapon that blunts the sharpness of human intelligence and the productive capacity of workers. Religion is used by the ruling class as a way of exploiting the masses of people. Many deeply believing Christians would see a lot of truth in that. My response: yet Marx created a man-made ideology which has clearly tried to play God, did he not? How very ironic, as well as how very much a failure it was in birthing a worker's paradise. World history is filled with such people, who in the end are buried alongside their pride as the great false lights they were to be consumed by the grave and consigned to the darkness thereof. It is quite amazing how so many of these so-called intellectual giants spend so much of their lives denying the very thing they attempt to become in their own delusions. Now that is irony at its most potent. These atheist secularist prophets embody the worst of religion and the most delusional of secularist thinking unified into one singular failed exercise of futility and arrogance. If God does not exist, only a fool would spend their lives trying to disprove the existence of something they say doesn't exist. Is that not an exercise in absurdity? Yet this is what these people do. I hardly met a more religion-obsessed person as a militant atheist. They are consumed with denying the very God they say cannot and does not exist. They are consumed with convincing those who do believe in God that they are wrong and merely simpletons devoid of intellect. How very odd this is. What a terrible state of existence to be confined in. The atheist truly is a pitiful creature to be chained in futility to such hatred towards what they are convinced has no existence. Their passion in this is profoundly irrational, is it not? Raising a standard. One can always find those who failed to live up the standard of their faith, even those adherents to Marxism. For in every instance they promised so much and delivered so little but great heartache, death, oppression, and suffering. How interesting today's Marxists are always trying to convince Christians the tightness of their cause, while history reveals quite another reality altogether. These same atheists are so sure of their belief in themselves and the rightness of their faith that God doesn't exist that they spend their lives trying to prove they themselves are God and convincing others of that fact in their own thinking, never realizing they are proving both the existence of the God they deny and what that God said about them as being true. Thinking themselves wise in their own eyes, they became fools, then spent their lives proving just how foolish they were until the grave claims them, denying them of their own mortal godhood, much like they did themselves to God Almighty. Not one of them have ever resurrected. Yet their ideologies still pollute the world as the false gospel of the arrogant and the damned. The devil's fishing expedition. One cannot go fishing on a vast ocean without using even the smallest of fishing hooks. So too it is with a lie. Even the most obvious lie has some small measure of truth in it. For if it did not, it would exist. Thus is why people are deceived by it. Something cannot be deceptive unless it has something to distort, to deceive, and someone with which to attempt to use it on to deceive into believing it. The devil goes fishing too. The nature of a lie. Just because an ideology has truisms and even some definable truth found within it does not presuppose the ideology nor the intent behind it is inherently based upon truth nor contextually sound in its use of truth. The same holds true for the concept of justice. A lie counterfeits the real things and reframed then in a manner which is intended to deceive. Let's look at the nature of a lie deeper. A lie is not the absence of truth, but rather truth distorted and taken out of context with intent to deceive. Thus is also confusion. Confusion is at its core ignorance or mixing up of original contextual intent and context. All lies are designed to sow confusion, but all confusion experienced by some individual is not born of an intent to deceive. Sometimes it is simply not getting things out rightly due to memory or mistake. However, this too is a result of confusion having been predicated by a first causality that bring corruption in the world at large and our human vulnerability to it. Likewise, it is for ideological constructs. This holds true for Marxism, which has some foundational truths born out of observation glued together with the mortar of personal biases, projection, false assumption, and insufficient perception. However, when one looks deeper, it becomes clear the ideology was built upon insufficient foundations. If one would like to properly evaluate the ideologies of Karl Marx and their validity, should we not hold his perspective up the same scrutiny which he used in judging religion? After all of are to be just and honest in analysis here, we must apply the same standard across the board, should we not? A bare necessity for deeper investigation. Let me put it this way. If I were to dress up as a bear and prowl around on all fours in a national park, would that make me a real bear? Or would it simply mean I was some fool dressed up in a realistic bear costume pretending to what I was not? What if I were to do so and various visitors to the park spotted me, stopped and began to take video and pictures of me, mistaking me for the being a real bear? Having never seen a bear in the wild nor getting close enough to make a proper observation of me to see if I were actually a real bear, of still just some crazy fools pretending to be a bear, does their false assumptions collectively make a real bear out of me simply because these park visitors collectively think me to be one? Of course not. Yet is this not what so many people do on a great many things in their lives? I mean, all it would have taken is a closer inspiration and some research into the behavior patterns of actual bears to see through my ruse. Yet few would take the time to do so, being quite assured that what they saw was indeed a real living, breathing bear. They would tell their friends and family about their sighting and even produce photographic and videographical evidence as proof. Those people would assume their friend or family members had told them the truth, never considering the possibility, nor questioning whether or not the bear was a real bear. Now this cascade would continue on and on with no further investigation by anyone, with everyone assuming the park visitor's story is genuine. Yet in this case all of them would have been deceived. The bear was just some fool dressed up in a bear costume. The shallows and the depths of the real. Is this ridiculous example not how people are with their observations of other more important and life-changing things in their lives, like ideologies? Anyone can dress themselves up in the garb of an ideology or belief system for innumerable reasons, yet know nearly nothing about them. They may develop their opinions and even construct elaborate theories and ideologies based upon a faulty assumption or poor life experience, with which they paint the totality of anything remotely reminiscent of their original bad experience. What if what they observed at the start was not the authentic version, but rather a counterfeit or distorted version of the thing they thought they were observing and experiencing? If they did not observe further and investigate the matter deeper and closer, and they may have no inkling that their perceptions and subsequent assumption upon which they built their theories and ideologies upon were flawed from the beginning. Now imagine those whom become adherents to that flawed belief system or ideological construct. We often call such people devotees or disciples of such men and women whose ideologies influence them to such a great degree. Fruit on the tree of good and evil. Isn't this the case of Marx? Let us look at his followers from the time of his life to present day. Are we not called to judge a tree by the fruit it bears? And is it not the case that we are to do so in the spirit of truth rather than the spirit of the age? What is the fruit of the tree of his life and ideologies? History would say not very good. Some people would even say that fruit is abhorrent and evil. Still others would say that just because the Marxist ideology failed in practice in all of its various incarnations, that we shouldn't cast aspersions on Karl Marx nor his ideologies, because those who followed in his footsteps failed to live up to do it properly. However, is this not exactly what Marx himself did on views of religion and the existence of God? Is this not exactly what those who follows in his footsteps did and still do? So what make their views more righteous than those they themselves cast aspersions upon, being Christians in this case, while not holding themselves to the same standard which they judge them? Is this not hypocrisy? Are we to believe that Karl Marx and his ideologies are somehow more evolved and logical than that of many thousands of years of beliefs in God and the theologies of Judeo-Christian beliefs? After all, Marxists have to borrow from the very language sets and beliefs of Judeo-Christian thoughts to postulate and construct their denials of it. Could they not self-generate their own worldview in use of language devoid of the very thing they wish to refute at least? Apparently not. Derivative confusion. This means that Marxist ideologies could not have even been conceived apart from the first causality of the existence of Christian theological constructs, for if they could, they surely would have done so, being that so many Marxists deny even the existence of the God of the Bible. Is this not exactly what a lie is? It has to take something out of context, deconstructing it and then reconstructing it into something different from the original. Is this not the very meaning of a counterfeit, a distortion? Yet these same people claim the authority and intellectual clarity, supreme logic and moral uprightness of their ideologies, even as they cast aspersions on those whose worldview they find detestable, though had to borrow from them nevertheless. Is that not pride and arrogance? In our days, the essential atheist Marxists couldn't beat the church, so they joined it and polluted it from within with clever machinations like liberation theology, which has yet again denied the essential heart of Christianity while co-opting it to claim moral superiority over others. This too is a perversion of the logos, for such Marxist liberation theologians have to elevate certain Christian doctrines over others they deny, ignore, or distort to maintain their intent. What is their intent? To inject the very Christianity they had to borrow from at the beginning, to pollute and take it over from within. This is the nature of deception. It is the nature of a lie. Likewise, it is the nature of a doomed ideological construct which must borrow and steal from the very thing it is at war against to exist. Such is the core evil at heart of a lie. It is meant to deconstruct, confuse, deceive, divide, and destroy. Yet it is trying to do so to the very system of belief it depends on to exist and deny. Now, if that sounds convoluted, it certainly is. It is also quite irrational and self-destructive. This is why we say that proclaiming themselves to be wise they became fools. This is why I said earlier that these pitiful creatures are enslaved to a lie and the futility which it brings in spending one's life fighting the very thing they deny exists. The deceived become proxies for the lie they are enslaved to, which uses them to deceive others. This is why they seek to convince and then deceive Christians into their ideologies, which are nothing more than corruptions of what Christians already believe, even if they have a difficult time living it out. Yet these Marxists, who do the same thing, are the first ones to point out the failures of Christians and others who do not conform to their own insufficient understanding of Christianity, even as they steal from Christianity to accuse, abuse, confuse, and deceive them. That, my dear friends, is the way of the Nechesh. The ancient serpent, also called Satan, operates. Satan is the father of lies, the accuser at the children of God, and comes to kill, steal, and destroy. No religion is a religion by another name. How can this be? Well, it also why I said these individuals under the domination of such ideologies are driven by the zeitgeist to deny the existence of God in order to pretend to be God and gain followers. Are we to believe Karl Marx is the secular saint so many believe him to be in both secular and religious circles? After all, there is reason they are all coming together in their present combined causes to wage war against all who do not bend a knee to their corruptive demands and delusional ideological points of view, though most have not the least bit of understanding as to where what they believe comes from beyond what they never questioned that seemed right in their own eyes. This is what you seeing play out right now before your very eyes. You are flooded with it in many of your churches, synagogues, mosques, schools, social circles, on social media, and by the news media. So I ask you, is what you say you believe based upon seeing what looked like a bear at the national park, or have you looked deeper only to find that it was not a bear at all? Just some damn fool dressed up to look like a bear at what at first look seemed to be a real bear. For those who don't look deeper, you might just find out the fake bear is a great deal more dangerous than the real bear and be torn to pieces by your false assumptions and the delusions which they inevitably bring. The departed ones. Some among our own ranks have departed from the truth and become proxies for the lie as sons and daughters of the spirit of the age. Were you not told this? Karl Marx, having been raised in and steeped in Jewish thought as well Christian theology, may well have gone astray and departed from the faith if he ever had a legitimate faith in any manner to begin with. I cannot judge his heart on this matter. Only the fruit of his life and its echoing effects through history to our present day. True freedom and liberty. There is freedom and liberty in Christ Jesus. This is not the case for such ideologies as Marxism and its various Antichrist incarnations and hybrids seen previously in history and presently in our own days. It is important for the spirit-filled follower of Christ to seek truth in all things and seek the highest good of all others in all things. For only the truth and love brings about justice and mercy from humble and contrite hearts reborn by and led into all truth by and the power of the Holy Spirit, which exposes the deceptions of this present zeitgeist. For it is the light of the Spirit of truth which exposes what was previously hidden by the spirit of the age in the darkness and frees those whom were previously blinded, the minds of those enslaved by that great darkness. Are you starting to see my point here? As it is for people, so too it is for nations. Max Daves. What was the professed so-called Christian communist Gill's response? He chose to ignore what I wrote to instead personally attack me. This sums up his paradox in doing so what he actually did on the public viewable discussion thread. The intellectually bereft locked in a lie. Don't you just find it ironic when the arrogant and fake expose themselves by ignoring what you put forth for consideration, choosing instead to cast aspersions upon you personally, never seeing the fact they have in fact ceded their credibility to you by trying to tear yours down? That is how pride is exposed in the prideful. It is often the precursor event to great suffering and hardship to be endured by those who chose their pride over humility. Some might even say their own actions act as a potent of troubles which they themselves are blind to due to their pride until the moment those troubles do come upon them like whirlwind of consequences. Denial is always revealed on the light of one's actions and written by the words thereof which reveal them. Truth to those who despise it sets ablaze the dry timber of their pride inside their souls and minds. They are predictable as the consuming of paper in a furnace by the flames thereof. Such genius has swollen the ranks of hell for many a millennia. Hell is filled with the souls of both religious and secularists alike, each blaming the other for their final fate. Likewise, it is also filled with the souls of Marxists and capitalists who spend eternity fighting over who had done the most harm to humanity during their lives on earth. As it is for people, so too it is for nations. Othniel Max Daves. Addendum 3b. Meta-War. The Mirrors of Zero Trust, Mass Psychosis, and National Self-Destruction. Author Othniel Max Daves. Othniel Psi. Zero Tolerance and Zero Trust. Denial is elevated an art form to those who are heading to their destruction. The desire for more and more control is elevated to a virtue by those who are terrified that their corruption and idiocy will be discovered. Such are politics and business interests when they are in bed together cheating on their spouses and degenerating their credibility for a short-term affair. A short-term affair is a short-term game and a long-term burning of the game board. Those who see life as a game also see people as game pieces to be used as they see fit in their competition with others who do the same. Politics are like social media platforms. They only wish to show you what ensures their own narratives, power and wealth while limiting and controlling your own. They have become slaves to their own existence and corruptions. Social media has become machines of the democratization of users' lives as digital merchandise and political objects to be manipulated and used as proxies against their own best interests and the good of the nation. These platforms have become weaponized against themselves and their own users, even as they both are being weaponized against one another, and the corrupted state weaponizes against everyone. Virtual reality is becoming, and in many cases already become, actual reality. This has created a cognitive environment of zero tolerance between warring digital tribes and zero trust in many people towards the very notions of objective truth. The result is a mass hysteria and endemic pandemic of fear-triggering induced pathogenic cascades in society across the 7 spheres. This has infected the leadership and much of the government and the national security establishment, resulting in further zero trust of the citizenry in both governmental authorities, business sectors, and one another. This has triggered a binary oppositional reactive blowback cycling vortex between the various oppositional forces throughout the nation, furthering the predicament we are all in. This is a great example of some of the foundational concepts in how unrestricted warfare is used against us and how it can be phantomized to create an intended effects chain in adversaries. https://youtube.com/watch and feature = share. The psychogenic capture and kill chain of stratagems. Psychogenic impacts can be induced in targets using a variety of means and methods of a virtual and real-world nature. Likewise, it can be used in a reversal to create appearances to cover the true reality of a situation. Since our adversaries are limited to perceptions based upon external appearances, they are highly vulnerable to both negative and positive inducements. This is very important to understand both in our current national situation and in the broader NITSEC global strategic reality. The nature of reality is tied to worldview and perception-based triggering of pre-established beliefs, experiences, and confirmation biases. This is why deep cultural and world implications are an imperative. When it is wedded to a well-crafted, integrated cross-domain strategic, tactical framework, the impacts on the battlefield can be decisive. The majority of any war happens in the cognitive realm before any kinetic conflict occurs. It can and does change the calculus for probabilities and outcomes in kinetic conflicts. Amplified effects are created in capture-kill chains, otherwise called stratagems by the Chinese. Psychogenic episodes are linked to spiritual, physical, and psychological predispositions as well as manufactured induced effects. This is difficult to reverse once the psychogenic carrier wave spreads through the population. It takes on a life of its own after a certain point of mass spread. We would put it into terms of hostile spiritual entities, lying and deceiving spirits. We were not given a spirit of fear nor confusion. Thus it is important to understand how that which works in fear and confusion functions and what its weaknesses and vulnerabilities are. Thus we have to expose it and tag it for what it is. What it does not know how to deal with is its target suddenly going offensive on it when such hostiles think they have gained control over their targets and the means and methods of narrative control. Once trust has been breached, it is difficult, if not impossible, to reestablish it with people. Zero trust in healthcare policies mimic zero trust in cybersecurity in many ways, but in a negative context. It is not limited to one industry or segment of the population. It spreads like a wildfire through all the 7 spheres, multiplying and amplifying oppositional blowback reactive cycles. This is what I call the whirlwind. This whirlwind is chaos. Zero trust is a security concept centered on the belief that organizations should not inherently trust entities inside or outside its perimeters, and instead should verify all requests to connect to its systems before granting access. The original concept of zero trust was a data-centric network design that leveraged micro-segmentation to enforce more granular rules and ultimately limit lateral movement by attackers. Since its inception, the concept of zero trust and its benefits have evolved significantly. Nowadays, zero trust is being used by organizations to drive strategic security initiatives and enable business decision-makers and its leaders to implement pragmatic prevention, detection, and response measures. This is currently being used against us beyond the cyber realm. It has taken on flesh and organizational structures. Now put this into a cognitive warfare psychosocial framework at scale. Once zero trust has occurred within a nation-state, particularly within the binary polarities of our system, or in a multipolar international manner, it is like a fire that spreads until it consumes all the flammable materials, in this case being the nation-states and those within them. This is where the paradox is. This usually results in very destructive conflicts and the resulting cascade effects which wreck the global order and the internal continuity of the nations. No part of the seven spheres are left unscathed. The abolition of self and its replacement by a mass group delusional false identity. The unwise use of the noble lie concept. The concept of a noble lie as it has been employed in this COVID-19 crisis has clearly backfired, creating an environment of divisive zero trust in the general population and within our own government. It has essentially reached a point of self-weaponizing fear and confusion, which also ironically self-justifies continuing doing it despite all evidence and logic to the contrary. This is why has occurred. Menticide has increasingly taken over the nation on the left side of the spectrum. This is extremely dangerous because it eventually creates the environment for suicidal and genocidal tendencies on a mass scale. It is born of delusion which, if not apprehended and mitigated, can result in civil wars or one-sided scapegoating of entire groups of people, leading an advanced stage psychotic break from reality which initiates the resulting bloodlust of menticide, which leads to mass suicidal and or genocidal outbreaks. A major contributing factors in such mass destruction are that of the jettisoning of objective truth, which comes on the devilish wings of widespread epidemics of pharmakia, which combine together to trigger exponential moral and ethical degeneration, which become obvious in long-duration crisis events like COVID-19. All of this mixed with the ever-amplifying fear and confusion, which amplifies exponential rage, blame shifting, delusional transference, and eventual a bloodlust-fueled explosion of violence such as seen in genocide and wars. Chaos births serpents and beasts. To put this into a simple context, these conditions birth bloodthirsty beasts. This is why I am continually warning of where we are in the cycle. It is also why my intensity has been amplifying and sounding the alarm. No nation is immune to this diabolical paradigm. That is why the decisions being made by this administration are in effect continuing to fuel the very conditions which makes this possible. The draconian machinations occurring are signaling to you that they are indeed going insane and heading down the road to great evils beyond the genocidal impacts already happening behind the scenes. It will not stop until it is stopped by force. By the time it becomes obvious to the public, it will be too late if it is not forced into the light of day now. This is why I have been doing and trying to get others to do. The longer the crisis continues and the so-called noble lie is employed, the faster the march to self-destruction nationally will occur. The situation is dire. It will not improve by being on the defensive alone. Offensive measures must be employed to expose the delusions and knock those under its influences off of their game plan. Another example of the noble lie: manufacturing consent and compliance. Oh, how they love their vaccines and profits. If the flu shot actually works, then maybe COVID-19 is actually the flu. Or the flu is actually just COVID-19. Or they are once again attempting to con more people into getting the COVID-19 vaccines by rebranding it simply as a flu vaccination. I would say the latter is more likely. Perhaps they should just give out gummy bears and call it the newest, most effective treatment for COVID-19 using the placebo approach, since placebos are nearly as effective, if not more so, than the actual vaccines are. Now consider how this paradigm can be flipped. I have been for quite some time. It will not be easy, nor will it be effective using traditional means and methods. The temptation of digital deception, anomie and totalitarianism regarding meta-war, cognitive anomie and disassociation. So how do you know what is real on LinkedIn or any other social network platform when they themselves don't know what is real? Consider the inherently difficult job of trying to determine intent on LinkedIn of posts and content. Those who judge things only by how they appear are blind to intent and reasoning behind content posts for this very reason. Thus they hide behind obscure community standards and rules of etiquette, weaponizing it against anything and anyone that may appear not to conform to their political, social, or ideological confirmation biases. Because they are solely making decisions upon how they feel and what they think they perceive visually or think they hear. All they are doing is merely looking for a reflection of themselves in what they subjectively wish to perceive. So too it is with the algorithms. They are highly vulnerable to the biases of those who program and train them. Both are used to attempt to force compliance to those confirmation biases which are used to socially engineer users into complicity. This is exactly how totalitarian regimes program their enslaved peoples. The platforms are dependent upon peoples to use them. It is the people collectively which have the power to push back on such machinations meant to isolate, silence, and intimidate users into complicity, and then use them as proxies against others who are perceived as potential threats to the control mechanisms of those wishing to weaponize such platforms. The lack of logical, clearly defined governmental, professional, and societal norms, standards, and accountability beyond the arbitrariness of obscuration, leaving all users vulnerable to being targets of all manner of malicious intents. This poses a great threat to freedom and liberty, with freedom of speech being a primary one. The reasons that companies and governments do not wish to hold such companies who own and run these platforms accountable is that they use them as tools for arbitrary enforcement of their own goals and objectives. Thus they are leveraged as a means of imposing their will upon the public without the accountability thereof. Hence, social media performs as machines of domination and mitigation. This is the great temptation. It is understandable that the companies who own these platforms wish to protect their investments in their users. They are businesses after all. Even so, they are companies constructed by people and run by people who are also vulnerable to the same hostile influences and exploitations of the vulnerabilities as everyone else. It is important for them to come to understand that their futures are not to be found in becoming proxies for the very ones wishing to destroy them and use them to destroy others along the way, but rather in exercising some wisdom and humility in how they implement their policies and procedures, these as well as how they craft and implement their community standards, lest they continue to be lured into the very maelstrom which threatens to destroy themselves and their users and their platforms by welcoming them against themselves and those fighting those hostile forces which are intent on their destruction. However, when hostile influences wormwood the business environment governing companies and co-opt them to unwise ends, the means and methods they use can also become a double-edged sword when companies usurp the government and or the people who use the platforms, creating an adversarial position between either or all of them. For the hostiles are much more adaptive than your company's capabilities and technologies might lead you to believe. Likewise, those who have to fight them also have to be more adaptive than both those they are fighting for. In this they are having to expose and fight. In matters of national security, the militant overzealousness of ideological hegemony and hyper-politicalization that have a tendency towards trampling the rights and freedoms of others and being used against their own best interests. The cognitive impacts of social media and the vulnerabilities of users to those effects have made these platforms virtual battlefields which are exploited by hostile actors. Here is where the overzealotry of the compromised and those who are intent in weaponizing it against them and others becomes a great problem. Those who are attempting to fight against it have to use unorthodox means, methods, and approaches to expose the machinations occurring. This is a complex battlefield in which one has to operate in, being that the hostiles have leveraged information and the external appearances of things against the very ones who are charged with exposing by making proxies out of those platforms, their employees, and the companies which own and run them alongside compromised users. All of these hindrances provide difficulty in social media settings and counterintelligence operations as they do in analysis of data in other settings. Here wherein is what can seem like a paradox to those fighting against these hostile influences. These platforms tend towards increasing rigidity, as are the users on them, through social engineering. This, in their minds, creates a predictable, controllable environment by which they think they can prevent the entropy of their platforms and the degeneration thereof. Yet in doing so, they actually create the conditions for it to occur more quickly, working against their own best interests, by working against those who are in fact fighting against those who are capable of rooting out those hostile influences and impacts. Thus they make enemies out of their allies and worsen their predicament and that of their governments, companies, and platforms, playing directly into the hands of their actual enemies. The obscurity of social conventions inherent in social media, along with the arbitrariness of their community standards, are thusly co-opted by the very ones they were established to guard against. The majority of users are inherently illiterate in digital media terms and are far too vulnerable to hyper-rigidity, not understanding the complexities of the online world, making them more vulnerable and exploitable. Likewise, they become stumbling blocks to those who do not use such conventional means and methods that do not conform to the oversimplification of the immediate perceptions and short-term quick views triggering singular posts may cause. There are many ways to teach and expose things which are harmful to others. This is even more the case in the complexities of the digital realm. Reality does not easily conform to mathematical algorithms nor external appearances. It is inherently destructive to think it does. For that is the trap the hostiles would like the censors and algorithms alike to become locked into. For when they do, they become unknowing proxies for them. I often say it is what you do not see that is your biggest problem. For how can you comprehend what you cannot see or even contemplate because you have been locked into the limitations of your confirmation biases, insufficient perceptions, and the five senses which interface with that which is beyond you? That is vulnerability. It is also what your enemies are exploiting in you. The emotive alone is not sufficient in providing the user with the discernment of what posts are valid or not valid any more than sitting in a movie theater make the movie any or real than if one was watching it at home on TV. The movie storyline is meant to be emotive fueling and triggering. Yet the theater goer does not leave the theater thinking that the movie is reality. It was just a movie. The nature of social media and its design's impacts on perceptions is where the emotive gets confused with reality. The rewriting of the user's brains online makes them highly influenceable to what could be deceptively hostile while inverting their perceptions. This is a great problem being exploited by information warfare and disinformation. People have to be cognitively freed from this in the middle of the very environment which impacted them to begin with. This makes the battle space extremely difficult. The nature of deception is that it relies upon the immediately observable. Your emotions, fears, preconceived biases, knowledge base, experienced in your perceptions collectively. Something would not be deceptive if it was easily discernible by just what you see and hear. Thus it hides behind what is, using it as a shield to conceal itself from your perceptions and camouflage its intents hidden behind it. It will use what you wish to see in your biases and perceptions and fuel them against you to your deception and destruction. Now, if you are so easily deceived by what is easily observable and looks like you think it should, why would think that what is not observable is or isn't deceptive? Sometimes what you think is the most objectionable to you may actually be fighting for you despite how it may appear on the surface. How would you know? Your algorithms and generally accepted social etiquette doesn't. It forces conformity to predictable behaviors and approaches. This has been weaponized against you also. Never be predictable in war lest you desire defeat. You must be adaptive and discerning. The approach I take is not normative by traditional standards for good reason. There is a reason I often say that there is a method to the appearance of madness in the way I do things both on and off social media. We are in a war after all. My job is to help others understand complex things in a very complex environment. It will not always appear to be what some think I should do. It is, however, designed to do something deeper and more beneficial to others. Unconventional hybrid below the threshold warfare is unconventional for a reason. Exposing it and helping others understand it likewise is not conventional. It requires adaptive means and methods that most people will not understand immediately. However, in time it will become understandable to those who are willing to persevere. Press in and be willing to be patient and thoughtful. It is called information warfare because it is a war. One being waged against your minds, bodies, and souls. Those of us who are fighting for you are doing so, fighting it in a way which in many cases may be not easily seen by you in singular social media posts, or a single video, or even in appearances. Be patient and willing to learn. If anyone wishes to talk about this deeper, I am always willing to have that discussion. To those who do not understand us, I freely admit that my ways are unorthodox and may even seem on the surface controversial. However, the external appearances may only be the delivery device I am using to convey something deeper and more important than the container of the delivery method. I do not use such methods lightly nor without good reason. Those who stay the course with me will come to understand this. Those who have this far already know that. I do not ask that you understand. I do ask that you be patient and willing to consider and ponder the means and methods, even the possibility that something deeper is at work. I don't require people agree with me on all things or even most things. What I ask is that some give me the runway to do what I know I can do to help mitigate and reverse the damage these people and the platforms themselves which have unintentional caused, and in fighting the information war against the enemies of the users and the platforms themselves in a manner which neither may understand fully. The alternative is to continue to become a stumbling block to those of us who you continue to unwisely treat as your enemies when we are in fact not. We are the ones fighting to clean up these platforms and expose the means and methods our enemies, near-peer competitors, and their proxies have leveraged against us all. The binary political spectrum will not suffice to mitigate the threats both sides see in one another, be them real or imagined. You are dealing with a highly advanced mind virus. See the mass impacts on pharmacia on the 7 spheres. See the physicality and physiology of induced low oxygenation on cognitive function. See the resulting impacts on immune system and psychological capabilities. See the impacts of broadcasted fear and confusion-induced stressors in triggering psychogenic mass illnesses, pandemics, and psychosis. See the impacts of moral and ethical entropy on the individual and the spiritual realities thereof. See guilt-shame response cycles and the projective transference mechanism at scale in societies. The paradox of social media platforms. My response to LinkedIn on censoring my posts and suspending my account. Thank you for your response. I provided you a cogent response which should have resolved this matter. Perhaps I did not make my perspective and that of my teams clear enough in detail, so I will attempt to do so here wherein LinkedIn, as it is with other social media platforms and the users thereof, are not above the laws of the United States nor above the agreements they have with the federal government pertaining to national security and law enforcement. That includes any third-party vendors or individual contracted to perform services on their behalf. Likewise, those who are charged with carrying out operations and activities for purposes of national security are not under any obligation to make that known to LinkedIn or any other platform, nor reveal our means and methods which we employ. I do so on behalf of myself and my teams out of respect for LinkedIn. LinkedIn is obligated to allow such operations and activities on their platform, however, as per the Patriot Act, FISA authorization, and a myriad of other laws, rules and regulations, and executive orders. Section 230. Section 230 does not grant any company the right to impede matter of national security. In fact, Section 230 was enacted under Congress, was created as part of a package of laws, rules, and regulations pertaining to national security regarding domestic and foreign threats. Any rights LinkedIn has as a person under the law do not hold supremacy over this fact. The core purpose of Section 230 is to protect the owners of any interactive computer service from liability for anything posted by third parties. The idea was that such protection was necessary to encourage the emergence of new types of communications and services at the dawn of the Internet era, not the censorship of users along perceived political or ideological lines. Likewise, Section 230 does not give blanket protection to companies or their vendors carte blanche rights to supersede any authority of the government or that of its defense, intelligence, or law enforcement departments, agencies, nor those individuals and or entities operating under them in a capacity commensurate with their own roles and responsibilities. As per the law, you do not have liability for posts by third parties, but you do have liability for any actions you take against users and or entities using your platform under which jeopardize, impair, and or impede the enforcement of laws and operations of the United States federal government and those operating as contractors or in an official capacity as part of law enforcement and or national security exemptions and exceptions which the federal government reserves the right to inform or not inform LinkedIn to. I would highly suggest you consider the fragility of the position you and the company you are representing is in and you are knowing or unknowing using to restrict the account in question. Section 230 was enacted in 1996 as part of a law called the Communications Decency Act, which was primarily aimed at curbing online pornography. Most of that law was struck down by the courts as an unconstitutional infringement on free speech, but Section 230 remains. From its inception, Section 230 was not blanket protection. There are exceptions for national security, federal crimes, or intellectual property claims. A company could still be held accountable if it knowingly allowed users to post illegal content, or impeded investigations and or operations related to national security. It does not have the authority to use the platform to infringe upon free speech nor government operations which take place on its platform. Section 230 and the exceptions and provisions predetermined as they pertain to national security is determined by FISA courts. DHS, DOJ, DOD, DHS, and Congress or face a breach of your company's responsibilities, thereby stripping the company of legal protections and rights under Section 230, which was enacted under the Federal Codex, and the exceptions, exemptions, rules, and regulations as they pertain to national security. By not releasing this account, and if any attempt to delete any content or connections to other users the account may have, LinkedIn is accepting by default the legal consequences for their actions, thereby placing in jeopardy their federal protections under Section 230. Matters vital to and of national security as they pertain to Section 230. By impeding those who are exempted from the dictates and arbitrary enforcement of your company's intentionally obscure community guidelines and arbitrary enforcement, LinkedIn will face legal action which could result in the suspension of the company's ability to operate their platforms under national security. A wise approach for social media platforms. Plurality and personal responsibility. 1. Clean and maintain your own house methodology. Personal responsibility by users for exercising their own freedom on their own profiles and the policing thereof of their own profiles. This does not extend to being able to censor the profile content and profiles of other users because they disagree with it or dislike the user. Each user has the freedom to exercise their own volition to not engage with the posts or the profiles of those whom they find offensive or non-aligned with their own views and perspectives. They cannot, however, use their user accounts to go on search and destroy missions to seek out objectionable content on others' profiles and posts simply because they do not conform to their subjective points of view. Personal preferences, perceived rules of etiquette, or political and or ideological differences. They are the master of what they see and experience. This means if they want something objectionable, they already have the freedom to not view it by navigating away from the posts or groups or profiles. To not do so if their choice, but it does not give them the right to ban it, censor it, or seek the destruction of the user who posted it. This would not be the case if they had no freedom to do so, but that is not the case. 2. Simplified rules of engagement. Users police their own profiles and group administrators and our members police their own groups. 3. Social media platforms will no longer censor and restrict users and user profiles and posts on the basis of external users' personal preferences and whims. They will only address issues of users being harassed, abused, and or attacked on their own platforms and personal posts by those who are not in their connections or followers. Otherwise, it is the users who must take responsibility for policing their own connections, communications, and comments of their network on their own profiles and posts. If their content is getting offensive comments by other users, they already have the means to block them and remove them from having access to that post or any future posts. 4. If LinkedIn wishes to escalate this issue by continuing to restrict this account, you will be accepting responsibility for and held accountable along with LinkedIn and any third-party vendors, acting as an agent of LinkedIn to federal authorities for impeding federal national security black box operations, which will necessitate the suspension of Section 230 protections for the company and the platform itself. They will make both the company and the individuals acting on its behalf subject to actions taken against them for impeding vital operations necessary for national security. Simply put, if you, acting on behalf of LinkedIn as a representative and or agent of the company regarding these matters, choose to not release this account, you are also accepting responsibility for yourself and the said company, LinkedIn, as well any third-party vendors they may be using or you may be performing your task under, making you liable for your own actions and that of any entities you represent. LinkedIn is currently not in compliance with its own agreements with the United States federal government nor in compliance with federal laws and executive orders impacted during a national crisis which falls under both those active executive orders, federal law, and national security requirements. You have all you need to release the account. If you wish to escalate this issue, then you are legally accepting responsibility for your actions and choices on behalf of LinkedIn and Microsoft and any associated third parties which they and you may or not be utilizing to operate behind or under. Once again, you are required to adhere to federal law and agreements with the federal government that fall under national security. A failure to do so will result in punitive actions taken against the company and those responsible for impeding governmental operations. As I stated in my previous email, we understand the difficulty in discerning intent of users on posts according to the law. We also know the capabilities of your own platform and its limitations in those areas. Making arbitrary decisions resulting in restrictions on accounts such this one in question boils down to intent. The very nature of deeming something offensive or the always ambiguous does not conform to our community standards. Accusation actually places the burden of proof on LinkedIn legally. This they cannot do without having defined specifically what those community guidelines are in detail. This is not something your clever legal teams will do. They prefer obscurity and subjectivist arbitrary enforcement to actual concrete defined parameters because they think it protects the company. Actually, it does the opposite. Of the federal laws, rules, and regulations worked in the same manner, no American nor company would have any freedom to operate without potential arbitrary targeting of their personages, never knowing where the actual lines of demarcation are. This is where LinkedIn is in a paradox. It must protect its business, its platform viability, and users' confidence in it without violating clearly defined federal and state laws while attempting to keep as much flexibility in its own rules and regulations to keep the platform viable. This is why community standards guidelines are problematic from a legal standpoint, not that it creates a legal paradox for companies which own and operate platforms like LinkedIn. After all, who establishes those guidelines? If it be the community, then that would be both LinkedIn and the users. Upon what basis can objective guidelines be established when nothing is actually specially defined? Yet if you define the two rigidly, you strangle the user's ability to use the platform or their willingness to use it. Add to this paradox, the platforms are global ones. Global culture, accepted social norms, and accepted behavior are not socially homogeneous any more than people in diverse cultures are all identical. Here wherein is the problem. What is or isn't offensive to one social group may or may not be normal social etiquette and behaviors from other. This is why the love and let live, or rather user responsibility to make informed choices to interact or not with other users based upon their own perspectives with the least amount of interference, besides intervening in case where there are users who actively target others' profiles and posts for malicious and even hostile reasons using clearly abusive and intrusive means and methods. This is what we generally characterize as trolls. Even so, the affected users in most cases have the ability to block them and report them already. What those same users do not have the right to do is seek to search out other users with whom they do not agree with and complain about content they already have the freedom to avoid and has not been forced upon them on their own posts. It is also where the slippery slope towards chaos and confusion meet the temptation to move towards the extreme of playing the parent to user when you have already provided them with both the tools and the freedom to avoid content they do not wish to see already. This problem is compounded when your platform attempts to assume that unwise role when there is no objective and overarching worldview. Cohesive social norms and our philosophical foundation provide a firm footing nor the ability to discern intent. So why do I bring those things up? You must understand, however, that we have a great deal of evidence from your platform which reveals a definitive chaotic, even confused potentially intentional or even unintentional, unequal and arbitrary enforcement of your own policies. We also know why it is that your community standards language is intentional, ambiguous, and obscure. We acknowledge your difficulty in this. We also have been cataloging that evidence which reveals a pattern of potentially illegal and dangerous arbitrary enforcement of those policies which reveal a clear weaponization of your platform against various users along ethnic, political and ideological lines from within your own apparatus, which constitutes a potential breach of your company's legal responsibilities. Likewise, we have been tracking many hostile actors on your platform which pose a clear and present threat to national security. We do not wish to make this any more complex for you or LinkedIn. As stated, we understand that LinkedIn made a mistake and are willing to look past it if the account is reinstated. Also stated to you in the previous email is the fact that regular disclaimers on the account in question are posted. It is the responsibility of the users to read these in the context of the entire account. That too is an additional disclaimer which is periodically posted. Few users go to such great lengths to inform their followers and connections as such. We do that, as I said, for legal reasons, which are defendable in court against those who would seek to limit our ability to operate freely on the platform. No one forces them to follow, view content, nor connect with the user. They do that on their own volition. We respect personal choice, freedom of speech, and personal responsibility. We do not attack other users of seemingly opposing views on their posts nor seek out arbitrary reasons to get them banned or restricted. For legal reasons such as that of the current issue on this account, those disclaimers are posted. If we had hostile intent on LinkedIn, we would not bother in doing such a thing. If we were educating others as to how to deal with content and how weaponized narratives and disinformation works, we would do as we have done, utilizing those disclaimers. That is our choice to do so. We are not required to do so. Yet we did so as a service to you at LinkedIn, a legal protection for ourselves, an example to others, and for the benefit of users on the platform. The overwhelming problems and complaints we have experienced on LinkedIn have been from individuals who are neither followers nor connections and thus have no relationship with us. They simply stumbled across a post or saw myself in a group or video conference and made a judgment call on a singular or small number of posts on my timeline. They have no idea what the profile is for nor what it is used for, which gained followers and connection across the DoD. I see in governmental space. We do, however, uncover and track trolls, criminals, terrorists, and hostile foreign intelligence operators. When necessary, we will use the platform's protocols and processes as your previous email suggested. It is well known that trolls and criminals use a search, deceive, and destroy method to silence or even abuse users. My use of the platform is lawfully and legally adhered to by the user commensurate with federal law, as is my teams, who likewise will add content for me or with me. We have evaluated this account to a plethora of other accounts which clearly are weaponized against both LinkedIn and users. Those accounts offer no such disclaimers nor conform to your rules, regulations, and obscure subjective community standards. We also know that you do not remove nor censor their content. If this were to go to federal court and or congressional hearings, you would be forced to answer for this in the public eye, harming both your company and the platform. It is in your best interests to release the account in question immediately. What we are willing to do is modify our approaches to some degree to calm your fears, but we are not willing to allow LinkedIn or their parent companies to impede our operations nor dictate what our means and methods can be as it pertains to national security. Educational instruction, counterintelligence, and counterterrorism operations, be them in the open or be them black box ones. One cannot be forced to agree to obscurity. Ask yourselves if it is legal to displace all responsibility of the user without any accountability of the service provider for their service. It is essentially a stripping away for end legal rights of users while attempting to absolve the company any and all risk and responsibility for their own actions. An agree between two parties means both assume roles and responsibilities. Since this is a bigger issue than just myself as a user and crosses into the government and specifically that of national security and ongoing cyber and information warfare, counterintelligence and counterterrorism operations, my account and that of my teams falls under something more authoritatively than LinkedIn's arbitrary agreements. Agreements which we submit to you have not even been violated due to your own obscurity and community standards. Likewise, we submit that LinkedIn is also impeding lawful and sanctioned activities which fall under the protections of national security, the Patriot Act, and more than a dozen more authoritative laws, acts, and presidential executive orders. If anything is the case, it is that LinkedIn has overstepped its authority unintentionally or intentionally. Now they have continued to restrict the account in question. Obscurity can be a legal maneuver to cover for unethical, unequal, arbitrary, and potentially unlawful enforcement of your own policies, rules, and regulations. I, along with my teams, have evaluated your community standards, your rules and regulations, as well as cataloged how and when you enforce them arbitrarily. That is a legal path you do not want to go down, nor can you win against the federal government in a FISI court nor in civil courts. What we are willing to agree to is continuing to place disclaimers on some posts, as we have at regular intervals, which provide both LinkedIn and ourselves the runway to do what we both have to do together and as separate entities. We have not been required to so. We did it out of respect to users, followers, and LinkedIn. It is the responsibility of LinkedIn to make known to users with specificity what is and what is not allowed on the platform in every specific area of user communications without ambiguity, including but not limited to a list of approved and unapproved words and a clearly defined lexicon made available to all users, approved grammar and sentence constructions, literary devices, approved and banned metaphors, specifically approved visual content standards, content themes, and be able to prove intent on all usage across the entire platform. Now, in doing so, LinkedIn would constrict free speech and grace yet another cascade of legal problems. So it is LinkedIn, not the users, who are in a trap of their own making by illegal and unequal arbitrary enforcement of obscure, which result in platform restrictions and censorship. It is a slippery legal slope, which is why I acknowledged clearly in my previous email the complexity thereof which LinkedIn unintentionally finds itself immersed in. The account in question is not the problem. We expose the problems and seek to mitigate them in the course of our operations by having added a digital literacy and content discernment educational approach to help teach critical thinking skills using creative means and methods. LinkedIn is not a babysitter nor an all-knowing arbiter of free speech, nor is it required to be under the law. It is the responsibility of the users to choose the content they wish to view or not wish to view according to their own volition. They have the right to use the platform and make informed decisions as they are fit. They also do not have the right to force censorship on other users when they each have the freedom of choice to choose to avoid it. Everyone has their own responsibility and freedom within rational limits. No one is forcing them to view content which they might personally and subjectively deem inappropriate or offensive to their personal preferences. As the old adage goes, you cannot please everyone all the time. Being that we work to help users overcome their confirmation biases and expose actual harmful schemes, crimes, and threats to the nation and users as per our mandates under the law and in accordance with our mission sets. LinkedIn should accept our efforts as a value add which they do not have to pay for, which benefits them greatly. As per agreeing to your requirements, the real question should be, is LinkedIn willing to uphold their own agreements and community standards and defend them in court as to how they are arbitrarily enforced? It is difficult to defend obscurity and arbitrariness, don't you think? Particularly when the evidence of it is evident on your own platform and history of censorship under that obscuration and its arbitrary enforcement. In court and in Congress, you would be forced to clearly define and defend every single action based upon that obscurantism and its arbitrary enforcement, placing LinkedIn and its parent company into great risk of large-scale federal punitive actions, as well as a multitude of class action lawsuits which would be very damaging to the company, being that is also a matter of national security. There are even worse consequences which could be triggered in addition. After all, the internet was built with federal money upon federal DOD and the intelligence agency's infrastructure, which is the foundation on which the backbone of your entire family of companies is built. Some things are best leaving alone, keeping simple and walking away from. This is my suggestion to you, being that you are representing LinkedIn in an official capacity. Your requirements are in breach of your legal responsibilities and have been found to be arbitrarily and unwisely applied. This will be made known to the public and handed over to our legal teams on both the civilian and defense sides if you continue to attempt to force what you cannot defend in a legal setting nor in Congress. If you continue to impede our operations and do not release this account, do you understand? Do you accept the responsibility for having read this email and acknowledge it? I appreciate your understanding and prudent work with us. I'll expect to have the account released and usable again within the next 24 hours. Addendum 3 degrees Celsius. Meta-war, asymmetrical 6th-generational warfare. Chinese use of WMD in unrestricted warfare. Chinese produce fentanyl and carfentanil. First use of a WMD on American soil through proxies. That means that we have passed the below-the-threshold warfare line. I hope the profits were worth it. The payback will be targeted at those responsible, not the citizens of the nations. May the sword of justice cut these whores of mammon down. What you have sown you will reap. Welcome to the whirlwind, the nations most known for weaponization. 1. China. 2. Russia. 3. Iran. 4. DPRK. The rise of the machines of corporatocracy. The corporations versus the government's AMD hybrids thereof. Transnational corporations and their leadership have been active proxies and complicit actors in enabling the use of these. All those involved, including corporations, cartels, and gangs, are responsible and should be treated as such and rounded up for crimes against humanity if you to avoid a global war that will make your kingdoms of sand burn until there is nothing but a sea of glass. We are at war. The global system and much of the leadership allowed this to occur and are engaged in devouring the people of the world. If it is not mitigated, consequences will be a global war waged of a kinetic nature which will cause great death and suffering. The lack of underfunding as to the nature of meta-war is as misunderstood as spiritual warfare often is in the church these days. There are big gaps in comprehension and discernment, being that both are inextricably linked together. One of the least understood within these is the impacts of pharmakia as a weapon of mass destruction. Chasing the dragon being led into destruction. The death by 1,000 cuts of pharmakia warfare. The poisoning of America by Chinese-derived synthetic opiates and constituent chemicals for meth. This term is a bit more complicated than merely smoking opium. It starts when you have your first high. The world is peaceful, everything is perfect, you're numb, but in the best way possible. But soon, it starts wearing off, fast. Your mind races, you're pulled out of your dream world. You crave the drug more and more, wanting to feel the same way as you did on your first high. You go to the dealer and buy the same amount you had the first time. And smoke. Still feels good, but not as good as first time. You go and buy more, closer, but not quite there. You're stuck. You don't know what to do. You want to go back to that little dream world and stay forever. But your body is already developing a tolerance. You panic. You use all your money to buy more and more and more, but still not the same as that first time. You realize that you have no more money, so you start selling your things, pawning whatever could get you that next bag. Still, nothing compared to what you had on that first magical time. So, you're broke and own nothing. But you don't care. All you care about is getting back to the first high. You start stealing, doing favors, whatever gets you the money for the attempt. Your life becomes a living hell, all in search of a repeat of the first high. That's chasing the dragon. Consider this from a strategic and tactical perspective across all domains in the 7 spheres. Why use nukes when you get more bang for THR buck using carfentanil as a WMD? Which would you choose as a weapon of mass destruction? A thermonuclear bomb or car fentanyl? Car fentanyl, it's not even close. North Korea recently tested a thermonuclear bomb with a mass of approximately 300 kg3 and an estimated yield of 250 kilotons for if exploded over a major urban center. A thermonuclear bomb of this weight would kill approximately 2 million people, i.e., about 10,000 people per kilogram of bomb mass. Fortunately, thermonuclear bombs are incredibly difficult to make. Delivered by intercontinental ballistic missiles, they invite likely obliteration of any country insane enough to launch a nuclear attack. Now consider carfentanil. Carfentanil is about twice as potent as sufentanil and 20-fold more potent than fentanyl. I confirmed potency of carfentanil with Dr. James Frost, who used carfentanil as an opioid ligand in human positron-emitted tomography studies over the past 3 decades. These initially used 0.1 mg kg1, but the investigators reduced the dose because of mild ventilatory depression. They found that 0.02 mg kg1 produced almost no discernible effect. This is compatible with a 20-fold potency relative to fentanyl, where 2 mg kg1 of fentanyl would cause mild ventilatory depression. Nevertheless, an opioid 20-fold more potent than fentanyl represents a significant threat. If 1,000 mg of fentanyl would be a lethal dose in the absence of ventilatory support, an equivalent lethal dose of carfentanil would be just 50 mg. As documented, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police seized 1 kilogram of carfentanil. 1 kilogram of carfentanil represents 20 million fatal 50 mg doses, enough to kill half the population of Canada. On a per kilogram basis, carfentanil is arguably 2,000-fold deadlier than a thermonuclear bomb. Now consider that here in America we have no idea how much carfentanil, fentanyl, meth, and cocaine is coming into the country. Even the most conservative estimates are so extreme that the amount of carfentanil alone would kill every single man, woman, and child on Earth. Now let that settle in for a moment. Weaponized commercial logistical networks. Everything has been weaponized in logistics networks and global shipping. Logistics have always been key in any type of warfare. Transport and supply chains have always comprised the nexus of need to dominate the battle space for centuries. Though manufacturing ranks with it on the list, any produced goods and trained personnel rely upon secure transport routes and nodes. You can have the greatest manufacturing capabilities in the world and the best trained personnel along with it, but if you do not have secure and reliable logistics to move them and continuously supply them in the battlefield, they are worthless in the fight. America won WW2 because of all of these capabilities. We no longer have that advantage in our present day. We cannot count upon dominating any of these vital areas in a protracted conventional war way near peer competitors. We also cannot expect to have uncontested land, air, sea, and space dominance either, when coupled with compromised technology, stolen IP which has leveled the playing field, scalable wartime manufacturing across industries, a readily available and unencumbered skilled labor force, or domestic-friendly patriotic companies, nor secure supply chains and global logistics. We must admit that we have experienced unprecedented entropy in our ability to maintain a competitive edge upon the emerging global threatscape. Our reliance upon high-tech has created over-reliance at the expense of low-tech and highly skilled adaptive thinking that can offset the loss of any of those relied upon systems in a near-peer kinetic conflict. For the moment, let us focus solely on the paradox we find ourselves in regarding a few components of the logistical problems we face and how what was once a major strength may well have become one of many glaring Achilles heels to our ability to defend our interests at home and around the world. War in a box. Every year 16 million CONEX containers come into America. Countless parcels are shipped from overseas into America, and globally 250 million of more CONEX containers are shipped around the world in the global logistics system. We have little knowledge as to what is and isn't on them, nor how much contraband like carfentanil and other drugs are in them, any more than we know how many of them contains weapons, platforms, and munitions, as we are flooded brilliantly written pieces of projective and diversive propaganda meant to do what it does: poison the minds of Americans against one another while diverting everyone from the CCP's ethnocentric superiority complex. They are looking down on all other peoples, tribes, cultures, worldviews, and national narratives. They are diabolical in their use of such tactics and effective in their machinations. Even so, they are being exposed in it, and the Dragon Imperium is being seen for what it is: a sham and a corruption of all things brought together in a well-crafted deception meant to pull all others down while they rise up. This they do as they play the wise, peaceful sage routine when they are anything but. They are not only an evil regime, but the worst kind of evil because they are so cunning at conning everyone else into believing it as they destroy them, particularly on how they are engaging in genocide, leveraging a myriad of profiteering manufactured means and methods. The synthetic opiates being just one of many which have killed tens of millions globally alone while allowing Beijing to maintain plausible deniability. Now consider the impact the opiate crisis has had upon our skilled and unskilled labor pool, and the resulting cascading social and security problems it presents us. We don't even admit currently that the unconventional use of unrestricted asymmetrical biochemical warfare has and is already being waged against us through our own supply chains and logistics networks already. It has already killed and rendered incapable millions of Americans to date, even without including the impacts of the biological weapon of COVID-19 and its dramatic impacts, which I will detail in an addendum document. Chinese unrestricted warfare. Weapons-grade fentanyl, WMDs, with hundreds of thousands of Americans dead, millions addicted and tens of millions more impacted by the opiate crisis, and a covert war being fought against them by China and organizers' criminal groups. If this is not a war being waged against the American people, I don't know what the hell one would be. We are being exterminated as a nation. Let's put things in perspective. Hybrid warfare and pharmacia. Below are figures from the 2016 National Survey on Drug Use and Health. 200 opiate overdose deaths average per day nationally. 11.5 million people misuse prescription opioids. 73,000 opiate overdose deaths average per year nationally. 2.1 million misuse prescription opioids for the first time. 948,000 people use heroin. $504 billion in economic costs. Long-lasting impacts on crime rates. Increased murder and violence. Increased numbers of incarcerated young men and women who otherwise could contribute to any war effort. Long-lasting health and well-being of citizens impacted, including our labor pool. Increased physical and cognitive impairment. Increased suicides. Increased health care and other associated costs. Weaponized pharma. Number of Americans addicted to opioids, which include prescription pain medications such as Vicodin and Percocet, along with illicit cousins such as heroin, 2.4 million. Number of Americans who died from opioids and other drugs last year, 64,000, nearly twice the number of deaths from motor vehicle crashes. Number of drug overdose deaths since 2000, more than 500,000, nearly 300,000 more than the number of murders involving guns. State with the highest number of annual overdose deaths. California, state with the highest annual rate of overdose deaths. West Virginia, look into the politicians who allowed it to happen. Amount of money paid out to Congress by pharmaceutical lobbying. Drug makers doled out $240 million for lobbying purposes 2014 alone, according to the Center for Responsive Politics, making it the biggest spender at 17.5% of GDP. In 2014, American health care costs have been rising faster than pharma's political tap. Pharmaceutical companies spend far more than any other industry to influence politicians. Drug makers have poured close to $2.5 billion into lobbying and funding members of Congress over the past decade. Total American Vietnam War casualties, 53,000 plus. Total in Korean War, 33,636 plus. The opiate epidemic numbers are civilian war casualty numbers. Time to fight it as a global war. Total war is now on the table. So having seen what opioid abuse has done to the civilian population in the previous blog, let's take a look at what it is doing to our nation's vets. More than 50% of all veterans enrolled in receiving care at VHI are affected by chronic pain, which is a much higher rate than in the general population, said a 2014 VI report. Veterans who suffer from chronic pain also experience much higher rates of other comorbidities: post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, traumatic brain injury, and socioeconomic dynamics that may contribute to the challenges of pain management when treated by opioids. However, prescription painkillers became the preferred tool for dealing with that pain. The Center for Investigative Reporting, using data provided under the Freedom of Information Act, said prescriptions for 4 opioids, hydrocodone, oxycodone, methadone, and morphine surged by 270% between 2000 and 2012. Leading to addictions and a fatal overdose rate that was twice the national average. In 2014, the VI said it issued 1.7 million prescriptions for opioids to 443,000 vets to be taken at home. citing a VI Office of Inspector General's report. The Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law said, between 2010 and 2015, the number of veterans addicted to opioids rose 55% to a total of roughly 68,000. This figure represents about 13% of all veterans currently prescribed opioids. Alarmed, the VI began cutting back its painkiller prescriptions in 2010. The agency says it reduced the number of vets receiving painkillers by 115,575 individuals between 2012 and 2015, and that it has 100,000 fewer vets on long-term opioid therapy. Still, it says it treated 66,000 vets for opioid addiction in fiscal 2016. We owe it to the nation's veterans to help them end their dependence on opioids, said VI Secretary Robert McDonald, and break the downward spiral that all too often leads to homeless, prison, or suicide. We are in an increasingly destabilized nation with long-term social and psychological maladies impacting physiological health and spiritual foundations. All of your systems are full entropy and compromised. Likewise, you do see as much as you may think you see. Both make you very vulnerable spiritually, cognitively, physically, and nationally. It is time to consider that seriously. As for people, so too for nations. Othniel Max Daves.